Chapter 08, Changing Times. Spike *. There was, Spike reflected, a really strange sound that the library made when it was really early in the morning. Or, rather, a really strange lack thereof, like a sound waiting to happen, drinking in the small noises of the night and transforming them into an expectant stillness. The library was filled with a kind of creepy hush, as if it were holding its breath while waiting to wake up. Spike, carrying his pillow slung over one shoulder, took great pains to make sure he wasn't the one to disturb the quiet of the night. He even went so far as to tiptoe down the stairs in order to not wake Twilight. When he reached the first floor, he stopped and listened for Twilight's soft snores, which she vehemently denied even existed, before he made his way towards the doorway to the basement. The first floor was lit only by the moonlight flooding in through the windows, casting everything in shifting blacks and silvery greys. Spike wasn't worried, though. Dragons had excellent night vision, which made the room perfectly clear, though also black and white. Not to mention the fact that Spike was a dragon with a mission, one which his caretaker boss Big Sister Twilight had told him to put on hold for the night so he could get some sleep. She even trotted out that same old, baby dragon, excuse she always used to stop him from having fun. But how could he sleep at a time like this? There wasn't much risk of waking Twilight up, now that he was on the first floor. Still, no point in risking everything by moving less than carefully. The daring Rex Rover, Diamond Dog Private Eye, is on the case, he whispered to himself as he moved slowly to the door that led down to the basement. Can Rex transport his cargo safely through the shadowy underworld? Can he make it past the forces of darkness that seek to stop him? When all the world is against him, can Rex survive? Who? Spike jumped and smothered a yelp before shooting Aloysius a dirty look. Rex Rover, Diamond Dog Private Eye, he whispered fiercely. The owl just stared at him. He's from a comic. Who? I said. Wait, you know what? Never mind, we're not doing this again. I'm going down to the basement, okay? Who? Spike frowned at the owl for a few seconds before shrugging and opening the basement door. Just don't wake Twilight, okay, buddy? Aloysius nodded and answered with a definitive, hoo. Right. Now where was I? Oh, yeah, the fearless Rex Rover, making his way into the deep, shadowy, really spooky basement. Okay, no problem. Spike braced himself, took a deep breath, and stepped through the doorway. After a few steps, he stopped and looked down the stairs. He could see 3 or 4 steps down before the rest of the staircase, along with the basement itself, was swallowed up in a pool of inky darkness. And, while Spike was gathering his courage, that's when the door swung shut by itself behind him, cutting off his only source of light. There was something Spike learned that day. He learned that there was what he had thought was dark, and then there was dark. A dark so dark that, even with his night vision, he couldn't see the end of his own snout in front of him. A dark that seeped into his eyes and right into his brain, paralyzing him and making his breath come in short, pained wheezes. Darkness that seemed almost liquid in its blackness, making him wonder if the rest of the world still existed, or if it had all just vanished. He stood there shivering, and the thought made it into his head that maybe he was all alone. Maybe there wasn't anything around him. Or, even worse, maybe there was. There could be something here with him, something that had been lurking below, waiting for the young dragon too. Oh, right. I'm a dragon. A short puff of green fire cast the stairway into oddly tinted shadows. More importantly, it showed him where the light switch was. Much better, Spike said a moment later as the lights came on. Not that I was scared or anything. His words were swallowed up by the basement, disappearing into a room that was crowded with Twilight's scientific equipment, cobwebs and dust, and no shortage of spooky shadowy places that things could be lurking in. He cleared his throat and walked down the rest of the stairs with as much nonchalance as he could muster. Under the stairway itself was a storage closet, which was the home of the winter blankets after winter wrap-up. Spike pulled one of the blankets out and put it on the floor as a sort of makeshift mattress. Then, nearly trembling with excitement, he reached into his pillows case and pulled out the purple and green tablet computer that Erin had given him as a present earlier in the day. Or, Spike realized, the previous day, since it was now extremely early in the morning. Stylus in one claw and tablet in the other, he tried to remember Twilight's instructions on how to turn it on. After a minute or two, he remembered the little button in the corner. Then he went to the icon called Videos, grinning when he saw how many movies were listed. Spike scrolled through until he found the one title he was looking for. There was only one problem. How come there are so many? He grumbled. I can't tell which one is the first one. He flipped through his choices, all while holding his stylus the same way he'd hold a quill. The movement started feeling natural to his hand pretty quickly. Oh, I get it. Some of these are sequels. The other ones, I don't know, they must be side stories. He frowned, concentrating. This looks like the first one, then. He double-tapped on his selection, just like Twilight had taught him, and the movie started up. Finally, he was going to see what this thing was all about. No more being put off or told that maybe they would get to it next time. He licked his lips in anticipation as the first words of the movie played over the tablet's speakers. This is Burke. Celestia*. When Celestia awoke, it was with a sense of peace and purpose. The obvious solution to a lot of problems had occurred to her just as she was waking, proving once again that a problem slept upon would often present its own solutions upon awaking. What had seemed like an insurmountable tangle of obligations and conflicting responsibilities had resolved itself into a nice, simple pattern, and now all that was left was to get every pony to go along with it. That was a worry for later in the day, however. For now, Celestia had responsibilities that she couldn't ignore. Her horn glowed a soft gold, lifting off her bedsheets as she stepped out of her bed. She stretched each leg and wing in turn as she stepped lightly to the eastern balcony of her quarters and regarded the horizon. It was still a dark purple from the night, though with a glow as the sun approached, burning off the last of the momentum that Celestia had given it the previous day. Canterlot was still sleeping beneath her, the flickering streetlights looking like very orderly stars below her. Here and there, a pony moved in the shadows, early risers on their way to work or late sleepers on their way home. Celestia smiled down at them before looking back to the glowing horizon. It was time to start the day. Outside of a few specific events, such as the summer sun celebration, not many ponies had ever seen Celestia actually raise the sun. When asked, the average pony would likely assume that some sort of ritual was needed in order for their princess to raise the sun. The truth was, after all this time, bringing the dawn had become a nearly effortless routine to her. It started, as always, with Celestia gathering her magic and will. Power swelled in her and she held it like her breath, wings spread at her sides as she began to glow a golden color that matched the glow from her horn. At one time, it had taken a circle of powerful unicorns to perform the ritual that Celestia now performed, drawing fresh runes of power into circles carved into the floor. Those circles had been infused with power, which the runes had helped to channel. Celestia had long since gone past the need for such assistance. She concentrated, and an image of the ritual circle and symbols flashing through her mind so quickly that she barely even noticed it. With the power gathered and shaped, she gave it a gentle nudge. A comforting warmth ran through her entire body as her connection to the sun was established. The truth was, nobody could move something as massive as the sun under their own power. Not even Discord, at least not without tapping into the highly dangerous primordial chaos itself, much like Celestia was now tapping into the power of the sun. This was not a secret, though very few knew it outside of the upper echelons of the Arcanum. She basked in that warmth for a long moment. Of the few pleasures her day allowed, this was her favorite. Still, duty called. She drew on a tiny fraction of the sun's tremendous, roiling power to give it a small push, adding to the momentum that kept the ball of fire, life and magic circling around the world. The horizon glowed pink and orange as the sun poked its crown over the distant hills. From Castle Canterlot, the sun could be seen much sooner than from down on the surface. It would still be some time before the villages around the base of Mount Canterlot would see more than a gentle brightening to the east. A calm satisfaction overcame her as she regarded the lands below. Ponies would be waking soon, starting the days warmed by the sun that she helped to move. Even after all this time, it was very satisfying to be so needed. Good morning, my old friend, Celestia murmured fondly towards the rising sun. It hadn't always been so easy. The ritual to move the sun was dangerous, so much so that many unicorns had either burned out their magic or had died during the daily ritual required to keep it moving. And Celestia hadn't always been as experienced as she was today. When she was very young, the touch of the sun upon her mind had terrified her. It was a burning fury, untamed and wild. It was a storm of pure power, it was elemental flame and life and, if she wasn't careful with it, a very quick death. A younger Celestia had struggled to master that fear enough to navigate the scorching tempest in order to prevent her own mind from being incinerated. Celestia had realized centuries ago that this danger was most likely why the mages of old hadn't minded passing the responsibility to a young and inexperienced alicorn. But after centuries of familiarity, the flood of power no longer frightened her. She held the power for just a moment longer and then, with a sigh, released it. The glow surrounding her faded as she walked serenely towards her private bathroom and the elegant shower contained within. Moments later, hot water poured down her neck and across her withers and back, soothing and relaxing her in almost the same way as the sun itself did. Hot running water was still one of Celestia's very favorite things. Life had been very different without it. The humid air surrounded her, and once again her mind wandered as it often did at this time of the day. She was glad to allow it. This was the only time she had to herself, before the demands of the day started clamoring for her attention. Celestia reflected briefly on her recent decision, which brought a small frown to her lips. Her ponies loved her, it was true, but, in spite of her best efforts to encourage them otherwise, they relied upon her so very much. She knew she was the rock upon which so many of them built their lives. She'd heard the joke before, or some variation of it, many times over the centuries. Only three things last forever, and those are death, taxes, and Celestia, though nobody knew for sure about the first two. This led her to memories of all the times she tried to give back control of the sun to the mages. Modern improvements to the ritual would cut the risk to nearly nothing, and it would be one less thing her little ponies relied upon her for. They'd always refused, of course. To them, as to most ponies, Celestia and the sun were very nearly the same thing. That obviously wasn't the case. Still, Celestia made certain the copies of the ritual were located in various places, including the Arcanum in Canterlot and the Mages College of Manhattan. Something as important as knowing how to move the sun was far too critical to leave with just one pony, no matter who that pony was. The sun hadn't always had ponies around to help move it. There were legends that she'd heard when she was very young, legends that spoke of ancient titans of massive power that moved the sun through a force of will. Those legends, as tattered and incomplete as they were, had been passed down to her by the very same unicorn wizards who had taught her the ritual that raised the sun. They had told her the stories in whispered fragments, as if afraid those titans would hear and return. It was possible, Celestia had decided ages ago, that such titans had once existed. Still, she doubted it. The wizards, with their scant century or so of years, had never gained the familiarity with the sun that she had. In truth, the sun wanted to be moved. It was made to be moved. Who or what made it in the first place was the more pertinent question than how it was moved before ponies came along. When she stepped out of the shower, coat awry and her mane wrapped in a towel, she was greeted by her retinue of morning helpers. This included 2 palace staff who carried her coat, another who would brush out her mane, and another for her tail. Also present was Quillmark, her personal secretary and keeper of the royal schedule, a title that Celestia had suggested some 5 centuries earlier as a joke, but which had stuck. Much like the secretary for remembering where all of the meeting rooms are, though that was usually shortened to secretary of rooms. Good morning, Celestia, Quillmark said with a brief inclination of her head. Good morning, Quill, Celestia replied pleasantly. It had taken her years to break her secretary of the habit of calling her princess and bowing every time she spoke. I see you've changed your style. Quillmark smiled briefly, running a hoof through her lavender mane. It was cut in a short bob, parting around either side of her horn and curling up at her jawline. Yes, I decided I wanted something easier to maintain. It looks very nice, Celestia said, both sincere and, briefly, slightly jealous. Her own mane, as much as ponies admired it, would never submit so easily to the shears. The last time she tried to have it cut, the stylist had eventually walked out of her own shop and taken up gardening on the far side of Equestria. Thank you. Shall we go over the schedule? Yes, thank you. Celestia listened as Quillmark ran through her morning appointments, managing to pay attention in spite of the ministrations of the royal groomers. She'd had lots of practice, after all. One somewhat surprising thing on the list was a request by Fair Trade, head of the Merchants Trade Association, for a meeting to discuss opening the gateway to Earth more frequently. Celestia considered that momentarily before nodding. Please let Fair Trade know that I will need to meet with the Arcanum before I can make a decision, and that I will meet with him in 2 days to discuss the possibility. Yes, Celestia, Quillmark said, making a note on her clipboard. I think that was about it. Was there anything you wanted to add? No. Wait, yes. Could you ask a runner to find my sister? I'd like her to meet me in the dining hall in half an hour. Yes, Celestia, Quill said, inclining her head once again. As Quillmark went out in the hallway to speak to the guards, Celestia relaxed and let the grooming staff work her over, making her presentable for the day. When she imagined how Luna would take her announcement, a small bubble of laughter almost made itself heard. She made do with a small, nearly hidden smile. A princess must preserve her image, after all. Aaron *. A vast expanse of grey stone stretched in every direction, crazed with small fishes but with a relentless sameness that made it impossible to tell one direction from any other. The distant horizon shimmered a greyish blue, promising no change for hundreds of miles, should anyone be foolish enough to attempt crossing it. Erin stood in the center of the field of cracked grey stone, dread clamping her chest and making it hard to breathe. With her hands pressed tightly to her breastbone, she could feel her heart hammering inside of her ribcage. Irregular tremors came from beneath her, traveling through her shoes, into her feet and up her legs. She couldn't see it, but she knew the tremors came from the motions of a great monster trapped below, lurching and pushing at its prison and attempting to escape. That, alone, would have been enough to terrify her. Years of nightmares regarding the black tide, and here it was separated from her by an unknown width of fragile cracked and flaking stone. But what was in the shack was much worse. 20 feet in front of her was a small, prefabricated white shack, flimsy and hastily assembled from plywood and covered with white aluminum siding. There was a single door set in the front of it, and the windows on either side of the door had their blinds drawn. On the door was a simple black painted knob, set into a white aluminum door with no windows and looking completely normal. And yet it somehow inspired a sick fear in her that she couldn't remember ever feeling before. She had to keep staring at it because, every time she looked away and back again, the shack was somehow closer. A sound came from behind her, the scuffling of a hoof on stone, and Erin's head whipped around. Nothing. The stone stretched on and on, completely empty. It was just her and Erin's head turned slowly, almost of its own accord. The shack was right in front of her, now, the door close enough to touch. Movement behind the door, some creature thrashing what was left of its body on the floor. A whimper tried to climb out of Erin's throat, only to be strangled halfway up. Her hand raised, independent of her will, reaching out for the handle. Please, she managed, her voice raspy and strained. Please, I don't want to open this door. Then don't, a voice said in her ear. Erin snorted and blinked, waking up with the icy chill of terror running down her back. Even as she tried to remember it, the dream cracked and melted like thin crystals of ice in the sun. All that was left was a sense of unease and the remembrance of terror as a voice spoke unexpectedly in her ear. As she lay trembling on her couch, and even as the dream faded, Erin realized that she knew that voice. It was a voice she'd just heard the previous day, after all. I've got to tell Pinky to stop showing up in my dreams, Erin mumbled, still shaking with spent adrenaline. After a few seconds, the absurdity of her comment filtered through her sleep-logged brain. She started chuckling, relief flooding her as she realized she was safe, in her home in Ponyville. A quick glance out the nearest window showed the brightening of the sky. Morning was close, and sleep felt like it was miles away, so Erin decided that she might as well start her day. With a grunt, she rolled off of her couch and onto the floor, only to stand there yawning hugely for a minute or more while scratching at her mane with a forehoof. When she finally made her way to the bathroom, she had to stop for a moment to gape at the mirror before breaking out into laughter. Wow, talk about bedhead. A couple of quick strokes with the brush took care of the worst of it, though she'd be winning no prizes for grooming. Her stomach rumbled as she brushed her morning breath away. She mentally reviewed the contents of her new kitchen, and found her options to be less than appealing. Aside from some staples she'd bought, there wasn't much she could use to make an appetizing breakfast. Not to mention that Erin wasn't the best of cooks even when she had hands. The type of disaster she could make in the kitchen with hooves didn't really bear thinking about. I guess it's more sugar cube corner leftovers, she said to her reflection. She stared at herself in the mirror for a long moment, wondering what it was about that statement that bothered her. It had been a couple of days, and the pastries were no doubt getting a little stale by now, but that didn't bother her much. As she rinsed the toothpaste out of her mouth, it hit her that she wouldn't be using a scent again anytime soon. This meant that any pony pudge she put on around the middle would be staying with her for a while. Which also meant, sadly, that her free cake ride was pretty much over and she had to start watching what she ate. Erin scowled at her reflection. Ain't no way I'm giving up cake, she growled. She poked a hoof at her reflection. You tryin' to take my cake. You think you're mayor enough to take my baked goods away. Her reflection didn't have much to say on the subject, so Erin stuck her tongue out and giggled. I think that's a vote for cake for breakfast, Erin concluded. Pony potbelly problems aside, she decided that she could always try to run the extra pounds off. And, since she preferred to eat after running, that meant ignoring her hunger for now, and walking past the kitchen to exit out her front door. The early March air was bracing, to say the least. Winter was over, but that didn't keep the chill out of the air, especially with the sun barely cresting the horizon. The air was crisp and clean in her nose and the early birds were twittering away in the treetops. She stretched her legs one by one as she looked around while planning out a route for her run. Erin heard the sound of a door closing nearby and looked around to see her next door neighbor, a light grey Pegasus with a blonde mane, just leaving her house. Erin smiled and trotted up to the fence that separated their front lawns. Good morning. The Pegasus jumped, her wings flexing slightly as she looked around. Her face relaxed into a smile when she saw Erin standing there. Oh, good morning, you're up early. I was going to go for a quick run this morning, Erin said. By the way, I don't think I ever introduced myself last time we met. I'm Erin. I also go by Sunflower, if you like that better. The Pegasus nodded. I know, you're the most popular subject of conversation around town these days. I'm Ditsy Do, or just Ditsy. Erin blinked. Ah. I know what you're thinking, Ditzy said with a wink. Ditzy is kind of a mean name, right? I mean, if you call someone a ditz, it must mean they're a little goofy, right? No, Erin stammered to a halt. Well, maybe a little. Don't worry about it, Ditzy said waving a hoof. I'm actually named after a flower, the Ditsonium. Lovely silver center with golden petals. Erin sagged with relief. Oh, really? Ditzy nodded soberly for a few seconds before bursting into laughter. No, not really, but that's my favorite joke. Erin joined in, giggling in spite of herself. Ditzy shook her head. No, sorry. I'm actually named after an aunt on Dad's side of the family. Ditzy was her nickname which, trust me, she earned. My mom thought it was a cute name but didn't know what it meant. So, your mom is a bit of a ditz, Erin ventured. Ditzy stared at her for a few seconds as Erin's smile slowly turned awkward. Then she started laughing once again, much to Erin's relief. You bet she was. Ditzy said, grinning. Erin breathed a sigh of relief before she returned Ditzy's smile. Say, do you have any plans for tonight? Ditzy asked. No, not really, Erin said. Just setting things up in the house. Did you want to come over for dinner tonight? Meet my daughter. I'll make my famous carrot casserole. Erin smiled. That would be wonderful, thanks. What time should I come over? We usually eat about 6. Should I bring anything? I have a bunch of leftover baked goods from my party at Sugarcube Corner, if you don't mind them being a couple of days old. Ditzy grinned. Oh, Dinky's going to adore you. That filly has a sweet tooth. Sure, bring some over. You got it, Erin said with a sharp nod. The name Dinky seemed familiar, though she couldn't remember where she'd heard it before. You can even keep some, if you want. You're going to spoil us rotten, Ditzy said, smiling and placing a hoof on Erin's shoulder. We'll see you at 6, then. You got it. Right, she said, spreading her wings and flapping them a couple of times. Well, it was nice meeting you again, Sunflower, but I really have to get going if I want to be on time. A couple of flaps later, and Ditzy was airborne. See you later, she called, waving a hoof. Bye. Erin called, waving back. She watched for a few seconds as Ditzy flew away and then, with a happy smile and a growing warmth in her heart, Erin turned towards the semi-wild grasslands outside of Ponyville to start her morning run. She started at a slow trot, getting the feel of things once again. Today felt like a clockwise day, so Erin turned right once she left the last road on the outskirts of town. The grasses were still wet with dew, and it wasn't long before she was soaked halfway to the knee on each leg. A few minutes later, Erin decided that she'd warmed up enough and let out a wild whoop while breaking into a gallop. She grinned into the wind as it streamed across her, making her mane and tail flow. Her legs were warming up nicely, and she pushed herself a little harder, the fields opening before her as she ran. 10 minutes later she collapsed, wheezing, in a field of daisies. She'd made it maybe halfway around what had once been her usual circuit around Ponyville before her legs had just given up, which is why she was now in the somewhat undignified position of laying on her side and gasping for breath while wildflowers tickled her nose and ears. In her previous stay in Ponyville, she'd run laps around the village at much higher speeds than she'd managed today, without even breaking a sweat until her third lap. Today, though, she was already at her limits. She wondered about it for a while, as she sucked in huge lungfuls of air while stretching her legs to keep them from cramping up. Of course it had to be the enhanced musculature of her old pony body that made the difference. She had turned down those enhancements since she hadn't wanted anything that would mess up the possibility of using magic. Besides, Earth Pony magic was supposed to give her enhanced strength and endurance. As Erin lay there in the daisies and idly contemplated throwing up in spite of her empty stomach, she decided that the Earth Pony magic must not be kicking in quite yet. After an uncounted number of minutes, Erin finally levered herself back to her hooves. Her legs felt weak and as wobbly as a foal's. A gallop was obviously out of the question, so Erin decided to walk for a while. It took a few minutes before enough of her strength returned for her to go back to a trot. It had been a long while since running had been this hard for her. When she'd first started going for morning runs back when she was a teenager, she'd had many days when she'd wanted to give up or just stay in bed. A few times, she actually had thrown up, which is why she always ate after she ran these days. As Erin switched back into a walk, she realized that she would just have to build her endurance up again the old-fashioned way, no ascent and no Earth Pony magic, just effort, sweat and resolve. She laughed in the early morning air. This is so going to suck, she said, her mouth turning up into a rueful smile. Celestia**. The royal dining hall was once again outfitted for breakfast. 2 royal servants stood against the walls with stoic expressions on their faces, waiting for orders. They steadfastly ignored the flying spoon that weaved and bobbed its way through the air, wrapped in a golden aura. The spoon, loaded with maple syrup-laced oatmeal, approached the tiny alicorn colt seated at the table. Yum, yum. Isn't this delicious, Verdant? The colt turned his head away stubbornly. No, Celestia sighed. It really is very good. And it will make you grow up big and strong. You want to grow up to be big and strong, right? Verdant scowled at her and pounded his little hooves on the table. No. Through the centuries, Celestia had dealt with stubborn ambassadors, intransigent nobles, cantankerous trade representatives and unbending foreign rulers. She had learned methods to sway even the most relentlessly headstrong to see things her way. All of that was simple and straightforward compared to getting a young colt to eat his breakfast, though much more likely to cause international conflict. Honey Heart stepped forward. If I may, Highness. Celestia smoothed away the frown on her muzzle as soon as she realized it had appeared. I suppose so. Thank you, Honey Heart said as her horn lit up. Verdant eyed her with evident mistrust in his eyes as she took the spoon away from Celestia. The nursemaid returned the look coolly, arching an eyebrow. You don't want this, Verdant? Honey Heart asked. Verdant shook his head, scowling like thunder. Good. That means that I get to eat it all, Honey Heart said. The spoon dipped towards her mouth and she mind eating it. Ooh, this is delicious. The scowl faded from Verdant's face as his ears lifted from laying flat on his head. A glimmer of curiosity crossed his features. Honey Heart dipped the spoon back towards the bowl, moving the spoon quickly so as to disguise the fact that she didn't actually scoop up any more oatmeal. Then she mind eating a second bite. This is so good. I'm going to eat the whole bowl, Verdant. Ah. Panic crossed the colt's face and he flung both forehooves towards his nursemaid. No, no, no. What? But you can't have any. Tiny hooves pounded the table. No, mine. But you didn't want any before. You want it now, yes. Verdant exclaimed, his bottom lip jutting out in a world-class pout. Honey Heart frowned at him before sighing. All right, but you have to eat the whole bowl, then. All right. Verdant nodded his head vigorously and reached out with his forehooves. First, say, please, Honey Heart said, holding the spoon just out of the foal's reach. Verdant looked almost on the verge of tears. Please. Now, that is a good boy, Honey Heart said with satisfaction, lowering the spoon towards the suddenly happy prince's mouth. Celestia watched, her heart aching at being excluded and her resolve building to change the situation, as Verdant began eating his breakfast, the spoon still held in Honey Heart's magical grasp. The soft click of the door opening distracted her, and she looked over her shoulder to see Luna stepping into the room. Good morning, sister, Luna said. Her horn lit up, and several small pastries lifted themselves off of the cart and floated towards her. You wish to speak with me? Yes, Luna, though it can wait until after you've eaten. How was the night court? Luna had just taken a large bite out of a pecan tart. She rolled her eyes before answering, her words muffled due to the food in her mouth. Dull, Nopany much wishes to speak to me, it seems. You shouldn't talk with your mouth full, Luna, Celestia admonished gently, chuckling when Luna glared at her. Luna rolled her eyes at her, but still finished swallowing her tart before continuing. I had a mere 2 petitioners before I closed the court. She snorted with annoyance. Warding the dream realms, at least, has provided me with something to keep me busy. I had to clear away several phantasms, a shade or two, and even a Baku before I could even begin to monitor our subjects' dreams. Celestia straightened up. A Baku, I thought they were extinct. Apparently not, Luna said with a shrug. I felt a little guilty chasing it off, to be honest. They are not ill-intentioned, but they are not harmless. Celestia bit her lower lip for a moment. If Luna was already overwhelmed, then her plan was in jeopardy. What she needed was some way to take the pressure off, to give her sister more time. The answer came to her in a flash of inspiration. Ah. I have an idea. Luna was in the middle of biting into another tart, raspberry this time. She made a circular motion with her hoof to indicate that Celestia should continue. How would you feel about re-establishing the Dream Guard? Celestia asked. She expected a reaction to this thought, and Luna didn't disappoint. She began hacking and coughing on her tart, pounding on her chest and bringing her glass of juice up to her muzzle with her magic. Verdant, distracted from his oatmeal by the display, goggled at her for a moment before he began giggling. Celestia smiled fondly at him for a moment before addressing his nursemaid. Honey Heart, could you take the young prince to the nursery and play with him for a while? Of course, Highness. Honey Heart bowed and lifted Verdant onto her back before leaving. By this time, Luna had finally recovered enough to croak out the word, what? Celestia shrugged. Why not? The ponies didn't always have us to ward the dreams, after all. Why not make them responsible for it once again? Luna scowled at that. And what then? Shall I once again be relegated to the role of the useless princess? Stuck away in a tower, merely raising the moon when you're too busy to do so yourself. Ah, in regards to that, Celestia began, speaking carefully. I'm afraid I have an ulterior motive for wanting to free up some of your time. And what, pray tell, might that be? I would like to take a step back from the government, and turn over many of my duties to you. Celestia watched as confusion ran over her sister's face. I wish to be more available for Verdant. Naturally, I would still be nearby in case you needed my help or advice, but you would be the primary princess in charge, running both the day and night courts on your own. Luna stared wide-eyed back at her. I am not certain I am ready for such a thing, Celestia. Celestia smiled comfortingly back at her, reaching across the table to pat her with a forehoof. You dealt with things well enough while I was injured a few months ago, she pointed out. Luna scoffed. That was both an emergency situation and also for a very short term. She looked away before mumbling, and I am certain that the whole time I was making nothing but mistake after mistake. Untrue, Celestia said gently. Besides, this time you wouldn't be alone, and the transition doesn't have to be sudden. We can take some time with it, though I would like to get this started sooner rather than later. How? How long would you want? Luna asked, her voice faint. Years. At least 5, Celestia confirmed before taking a sip of her tea. He would be in school by then, which will hopefully free up more of my time. Luna looked torn. If Celestia had to guess, her desire for recognition and respect were warring with her inner belief that she deserved neither. It wasn't only for Verdant's sake that Celestia wanted this time away from the throne, after all. Finally, Luna took a deep breath and gave a sharp nod. I'll do it, Celestia smiled. Thank you, Luna. Mikel Rost *. Dr. Edwards leaned back in his chair, steepled his fingers under his chin, and frowned across the conference table. So, you wanted to show me something. Dr. Mikel Rost, a thin, tall black man in his early 40s, nodded and grinned. It's right here, hold on. Mikel stood and reached down to the large wheel trunk he'd rolled into the conference room with him. He undid the latches and flipped open the lid, causing a hiss of outrushing, shockingly cold air that caused a mist to roll along the floor. Liquid nitrogen, he said as he pulled on a heavy pair of safety gloves. No idea if it helps keep this dormant or not, but it seems crazy not to at least try. Dr. Edwards' scowl deepened. Keep what dormant, Mikel? In response, Mikel heaved at something hidden in the foggy depths of the trunk. What he lifted out was a large, flat-bottomed globe of thick acrylic with a handle along on top like a kettlebell. When Dr. Edwards saw what was inside, he surged to his feet with a panicked shout, his chair shooting backwards and hitting the conference room wall. Mikel rolled his eyes at him. Relax, Tom. It's dormant, like I said. Good God, man. How could you bring that here? I told you, it's harmless like this. I've been studying it for weeks, now. He grinned. Did you know it looks just a little bit like brain tissue under a microscope? Does anyone know you have it? Robert Thompson does, Mikel said smugly. He authorized my research. Dr. Edwards' eyes narrowed. I'll be checking that with him, just so you know. Mikhail shrugged, spreading his hands in front of him, palms up. The globe sat on the table, a discolored ring spreading away from the globe as the top was damaged by the extreme cold. Properties is going to kill you for the damage to the table, Dr. Edwards said absently. Mikhail shrugged. They can bill me. More time passed while Mikhail waited for his old mentor to make up his mind. And what's in it for me? He asked finally. Mikhail's grin widened. Co-authorship on any paper we write. I'll even let you have top billing. Dr. Edwards snorted. We'll be tarred and feathered if the wrong people find out we're working on this. Mikhail laughed, knowing that he'd gotten what he wanted. He reached out his hand as Dr. Edwards reached out his own. They shook hands across the table while the basketball-sized chunk of dormant black tide slowly warmed up between them. Author's notes. And now for some more editing shenanigans. BP's editor's note. From the We Take Our Editing and Writing Very Serious department. Celestia listened as Quillmark ran through her morning appointments, managing to pay attention in spite of the ministrations of the royal groomers. She'd had lots of practice, after all. BP, I would pay good money to watch the first day of one of those groomers, especially if they had to groom the royal tush. Hoopy, the royal posterior isn't a place for newcomers to sharpen their skills, oh no. New royal groomers mustn't start at the bottom. Ekivu, she probably is good at ignoring even the newbies thanks to the power of daily rituals. BP, but will the new guy be able to ignore the royal tush? Chapter 09, Departures. Tilda asterisk Erin asterisk tilde. The front door opened to allow a wobbly-legged Erin to stagger into her home. A nudge with a hind leg closed the door behind her as Erin made her way to the kitchen. With her legs all trembling, it was an easy decision for her to not bother with a glass, instead just turning on the faucet and sticking her head under the flow of water with her mouth open as she drank greedily. Once sated, Erin sat back and ran a foreleg across her wet mouth. That run had been much harder than she'd expected. Not only were her legs sore and her mane and tail a knotted mess, but the dried sweat in her coat was making the hair stick out in crazy spikes and swirls all over her body. She made her way into the bathroom, turning on the shower and letting the water heat up to lukewarm before hopping in. With a contented sigh, she just stood under the jet of water, letting it sluice over her, tickling the hair on her belly as it ran down towards her hooves. 30 minutes later, and after some vigorous scrubbing, Erin stepped out while drying herself with a large white towel. The bottom of her bathtub was dotted with burrs and plant debris that she'd painstakingly pulled out of her coat and tail, minor trophies that she'd acquired during her run through the tall grass and wildflowers on the outskirts of Ponyville. Erin did her best to ignore her growling stomach as she started grooming herself. She started with her mane and worked along her coat before finally finishing up with her tail, pulling out a few more burrs that she'd missed along the way. When she was finished with the brushing, she opened up her Feathermaster kit in order to attend to her wings. It was a very different Erin who stepped out of the bathroom almost an hour after she had first gone in. Most of the exhaustion was gone, and her hair was nicely brushed, though still damp. As she made her way to the kitchen in order to finally shut up her complaining stomach, a thought occurred to her. Oh, yeah. I was supposed to start bringing Twilight with me on my morning runs. She chuckled as she opened the cardboard box that held the rest of the bakery items from her welcome back party. Back in her old pony body, Twilight had barely been able to keep up with her even when Erin was going slowly. Now, she had to wonder whether or not her unicorn friend would be leaving her in the dust. As she chewed on a raspberry-filled jelly donut, Erin decided that she could worry about that later. If nothing else, Twilight being in better shape than she was might actually convince the bookish unicorn to get out and exercise more often, which was a win-win as far as Erin was concerned. Erin considered her plans for the day as she washed down her less than healthy breakfast with still more water directly from the sink. More unpacking didn't seem all that appealing, and, as comfortable as her couch was, she wanted an actual, real bed. And maybe some foods that would be simpler for her to prepare wouldn't be a bad idea. Shopping it is, then, Erin said as she walked back towards the front door. She slipped on her pine green saddlebags with the sunflower clasps and went outside. She decided to leave the cart behind, opting to keep the grocery shopping to the minimum for now, at least until she got better at cooking. With her legs recovered from her morning run, Erin smiled and broke into an easy trot, heading towards the main market of Ponyville. Tilda asterisk Spike asterisk tilde. Spike's dreams of flying were rudely interrupted by a feeling of minor heartburn and a familiar rumble in his gut. Even being roused out of a deep sleep, he knew what to expect and, out of habit, he angled his head upwards just as a massive flame-shrouded bell tripped its way out of his mouth. Smacking his lips to clear the aftertaste, Spike rolled over and hiked his blanket up around his shoulders. Letter, Twilight, he mumbled as he tried to drift off again. A few seconds passed, and he became vaguely aware that Twilight hadn't responded. He lifted a groggy head and then spent the next few seconds staring around in blank confusion. He wasn't in his basket at the foot of Twilight's bed. He wasn't even on the main floor. He was, for some unknown reason, laying cocooned in some blankets in the basement. The previous night came back to him in a sudden rush. He had been watching movies on his tablet, without Twilight's supervision, and he had really enjoyed himself, though it had taken him a while to get used to the whole dragons as pets thing. His only regret was that he hadn't been able to figure out a way to sneak back up into the kitchen and make popcorn without waking up Twilight in the process. Muster fell asleep, Spike mumbled. The movies had been great, with the second being even better than the first, and the third at least starting out amazing. His memory of the third movie washed out after a little while, and he realized he must have fallen asleep shortly after the movie had started. Spike yawned hugely and rubbed a hand across his eyes to clear the sleep crust away as he looked around for his tablet. He finally spotted it lying on the floor next to where he'd spent the night curled up. He picked it up with a grin, deciding that there was no time like the present to finish watching that movie, before Twilight found him and started loading up his days with chores. The screen was dark, so he hit the button on top like Twilight had told him to do. Nothing happened. Spike blinked and pushed the button again, this time a little harder. Nothing continued to happen, much to Spike's growing alarm. He pushed it again and, after not getting any response from the tablet, raised it above his head and shook it gently. It didn't do any good. Tears welled up in Spike's eyes. Oh no, I broke it. He tossed aside his blankets and, chubby legs pumping, raced up the stairs while sobs hitched at his lungs. He flung the basement door open and took a deep breath. Tree high leet, came the sobbing wail as he ran through the library. Spike. Spike looked around to see Twilight, looking slightly frazzled herself as she stood by the front door with her saddlebags on. Spike. Where have you? Twilight shook her head and took a few steps towards him. Never mind. What's wrong? I broke it. Spike cried, holding out his precious tablet. Twilight blinked at it as she picked the tablet up with her magic, frowning for a moment before a look of realization came into her eyes. Spike, did you spend the whole night playing with your tablet? If he'd been less upset, Spike would have noticed the half-dangerous, half-amused tone of voice that Twilight was directing towards him. As it was, he was too wound up in his personal tragedy to notice. Yeah, and then I fell asleep, and when I woke up it wouldn't turn back on. All the crying had made Spike's nose runny, so he rubbed his forearm across his snout and snuffled, not noticing Twilight's shudder as he did so. Then he flung himself forward and hugged her around one foreleg. I bro ho hook I. Spike cried miserably. It's not broken, Spike, Twilight said as she tried to tug her leg out of his grasp. It just needs more power. The battery ran out. Spike looked up at her, the fires of hope swelling in him. Really? Yes, really, Twilight said, finally able to extract her leg from his embrace. She grimaced at a shiny spot on her fur before continuing. You just need to plug it in for a while and it should be fine. Relief washed over him, drowning out every other emotion and bringing out a huge smile on his face. That's great, he said, directing his grin at Twilight. The look she directed back down at him made his smile falter as the relief started to drain away. It was the perfectly straight mouth, narrow eyes and raised eyebrow that Twilight used whenever she wanted to let him know that he'd gone and messed something up. Oh. I suppose I'm in trouble, he asked weakly. Twilight considered this for a moment. Yes and no. Spike replied, completely at a loss. Fortunately, Twilight was more than willing to fill him in. No, you're not in trouble for sneaking off and watching movies all night instead of sleeping. I think the worry you went through when you thought you'd broken your tablet is enough punishment for that. Twilight smiled gently down at him and rubbed his head with a hoof. Spike breathed a sigh of relief. Oh, good, because I thought. However, Twilight continued, for disappearing without telling me where you were and making me worry all morning, I think it's only fair that you get some punishment for that. She frowned down at him, anguish plain on her features. I was really worried, Spike. I was about to go out and try to find you. Oh, Spike looked down at the floor and saw that he was tracing a random doodle on the floor with his toes. I didn't think of that. I'm sorry. Twilight drew him into a hug. Apology accepted. And no using your tablet for 3 days. What? Spike tried to squirm his way out of Twilight's embrace. Come on, Twilight. Nope, sorry, Twilight said, hugging him tighter. Though, with good behavior, I might trim the sentence down to 2 days. Fine, Spike grumbled. Oh, I forgot. You got a letter. That's what woke me up. Well, you'd better go get it, then, shouldn't you? Twilight's voice was teasing as she released him and ruffled his spines with a hoof once again. You got it. It only took a minute for Spike to get back down to the basement, pack up the blankets in storage once again, and get back upstairs with the scroll. Twilight took it in her magic and unrolled it, reading it quietly for a minute or so. She said eventually. What's up? Princess Celestia is asking if I can come to Canterlot today. Apparently, she has something she wants to discuss with me. Oh. Does she say why? It looks like a few things, really, Twilight said, rolling up the scroll and set it on a nearby shelf. One is, it looks like she's going to announce a change to the schedule for the Gateway to Earth. You think she's going to make it happen more often? Probably, judging by the second thing she wanted to talk to me about. Spike glanced at the scroll before looking back at Twilight. She seemed both excited and nervous about something. There was probably a word for that, but he was at a loss to think of it. What's that? He asked. Well, apparently there's some sort of cultural exchange program about to start up. Human students are going to come to Equestria for school, and ponies are going to Earth for the same reason. Twilight grinned awkwardly and shrugged. The mayor that was organizing things can't see it through, for some reason, so she's asking if I could help organize the reception and orientation of the students heading to Earth, as well as the humans coming to Equestria. Spike considered that for a moment. Wouldn't Erin be useful for that? Good point, Twilight said with a nod and a frown. I'll ask the princess if I can invite her. Is that all? No, Twilight said, still frowning. There was something else that she didn't want to put down in a scroll that she said she wanted to tell me personally. Spike snorted. I'm surprised you're not out the door already. Don't be silly, Spike. Twilight glanced at the clock on a nearby shelf. The next express train to Canterlot doesn't arrive for another 40 minutes. Spike gaped at her. You seriously have the train timetables memorized? Yeah. Twilight raised an eyebrow. It's not like it's all of them. Just the ones to and from Canterlot. He blinked at her a few times before shrugging. I honestly have nothing to say to that. Twilight rolled her eyes. Seriously, though, would you mind running around and letting the girls know that I may be gone for a couple of days? She grimaced down at the shiny spot on her leg. I need to shower really quickly before I head out, so I won't have time to do it myself. You got it, Twilight. Spike fired off a salute and charged towards the door. Operation, be on best behavior in order to get the tablet back faster, was off to a running start. Erin tilde. There was only one store in town that actually sold beds, and that was Hatrack's Furniture Warehouse. With their small selection, it hadn't taken Erin long to decide on which to buy. It was roughly the same size as a full-sized human bed, though slightly shorter. She also purchased a few small bookshelves, a nightstand, and several other bits and pieces that Erin hadn't realized she needed, such as a thick, wiry welcome mat for visitors to clean their hooves on before walking into her house. Some accent art had been added to the purchase as well. Amongst the many landscape paintings available, there had been 2 pieces that had taken Erin's interest. One was a watercolor of Cloudsdale, looking dreamlike and mystical. The other had been a strangely compelling picture of a frozen lake in wintertime, with dead reeds poking up above the snow cover. The Salas bunny that had helped her, a stallion by the name of Tallymark, had seemed surprised at her interest in those 2 paintings, particularly the frozen lake. Erin had gotten the impression that the lake painting had been in stock for a while, without any pony showing much interest in it. For some reason, that made her all the more determined to buy it. With her bit bag significantly lighter and the delivery arranged for the next day, Erin left Hattrack's store with a satisfied smile on her face. Being able to spend so much money so freely was still a new experience for her, and there was something deeply satisfying about spending so much and knowing that she still had plenty left. Erin was still composing a grocery list in her mind when someone came up behind her and tugged on her tail. Her ears flattened instinctively as she rounded on whoever it was that would be rude enough to do that. Her mouth was already open, ready for the scathing reproach that had jumped immediately to mind. When she realized that it was a breathless Spike, her annoyance melted away. The poor little guy looked like he'd been running himself into the ground. Spike. Is everything okay? The little dragon nodded and held up a claw to indicate the need for a moment to catch his breath as he gasped for air. Hey, Erin, he said, once he'd recovered enough. Twilight wanted me to let everybody know that she'd be going to Canterlot for a couple of days at least. The princess wants her for something. Erin blinked. Oh, okay, thanks. How's that going? I told Rarity and Pinkie Pie first thing. And, lucky for me, Applejack had her stall set up in the market. I still have to tell Rainbow and Fluttershy, though. A panicked look came over Spike's face as he looked at the big clock tower in the middle of town. Oh, no, the train will be here in another 10 minutes. I have to get back before then. Erin smiled down at him and ruffled the spines on his head. If you wanted me to, I'd be happy to tell Rainbow and Fluttershy. The look of relief that washed over the dragon's face made Erin giggle a little. You'd do that, sure. It's not like I'm going to be late for work or anything. Erin shrugged. Besides, there's no way you'd make it to Fluttershy's and back in 10 minutes. I was going to go to Rainbow Dash's house next, and ask her to fly me out there and back, Spike said. But now I don't have to worry about that. Thanks, Erin. You bet, Spike. Always glad to help. Spike started running off before stopping a short distance away. Oh, I almost forgot. One of the reasons Princess Celestia wanted Twilight to come out was because of some sort of exchange program. Erin raised an eyebrow. Exchange program, yeah. I guess some colts and fillies are going to Earth, and some human kids are coming to Equestria for school. Anyway, Twilight was going to ask if it was okay with the princess if she asked you to come out. Wow, a student exchange program. Neat. Erin grinned. I'd be happy to help out, if Princess Celestia wants me to. Thanks. I'll let Twilight know. Spike started walking quickly away, waving over his shoulder. Thanks, Erin. Oh, and thanks for the cool tablet thing, too. You got it, Spike. Erin called back, waving a hoof. Spike disappeared around a corner at a quick jog. Erin chuckled and shook her head before starting her walk once again. It looked like grocery shopping would have to wait a bit, she decided as she made her way, once again, towards Rainbow Dash's cloud house. Twilight *. Twilight Sparkle had showered as fast as was equinely possible, in order to save precious minutes before her trip to Canterlot. She'd even left her mane damp rather than trying to dry it since, even with a drying spell, doing so would still add minutes of time to getting ready. She had packed her saddlebags with crisp efficiency, reusing an old, tried and true checklist to make sure that she had everything she could possibly need. Specifically, she had used the pre-mission, non-test checklist, which was heavy on preparatory items like scrolls, ink and quills, but light on flashcards and other study aids. She wasn't going to Canterlot to take a test, after all, but she had to be ready for whatever it was that Celestia wanted her to do. And now she found herself ready but unable to go, pacing back and forth in the large, central room on the main floor of the library as her tension mounted higher and higher. Every time she changed directions, she would steal a glance at the wall clock, mutter darkly, and then start pacing again. Her options were limited to only 3, from what she could see. 1, she could keep waiting for Spike, who may or may not show up on time for them to get to the train. 2, she could go out and find him, which ran a high risk of them missing each other and, thus, the train, which was clearly unacceptable. The third option, which she was most inclined to choose at the moment, was to head to the train station immediately while leaving a note for Spike to follow as soon as he got home. Upon reflection, option 3 had some obvious problems, mainly in that Spike may not see the note, or might not arrive at the station on time if he did. Which would mean that Twilight would still miss the train regardless. The more she considered it, the less viable it seemed. The only time savings would be in the purchasing of the tickets. While she was considering her options, the clock ticked and sliced off another minute of her day. The low, frustrated growl that started building in her throat cut off as the library door opened and Spike stumbled in. The little dragon stopped in the doorway, bending over with his hands on his knees as he wheezed and tried to catch his breath. Twilight's annoyance was immediately swamped by a flood of sympathy. The little guy had obviously been running himself ragged in order to do what she asked. As she watched her number 1 assistant and best friend struggle for air, guilt also started to make itself known, welling up in her chest and crowding out the last of her frustration. She had given him an impossible task, she realized. Of course he'd have run himself ragged trying to achieve it. Still, there was a schedule to keep, and the train would be arriving from Canterlot very soon. Twilight cleared her throat. Are you okay, Spike? Yeah. Just out of breath. He straightened with a grunt. Told every pony but Rainbow and Fluttershy. Erin said she'd take care of it for me. You did a great job, Spike, Twilight said, making sure she had a smile on her face. Spike beamed back at her as her horn lit up. I'll carry you to the station, all right. Spike nodded, and Twilight lifted him onto her back. There was only one stop to make on the way to the station. About a block away from the library was a small cottage with a tiny but well-kept garden. Twilight made her way through the gate and knocked on the white-painted door. It was hard to keep her hoof from tapping as she waited on the front step for the pony inside to answer. In fact, she just raised her hoof to knock again when an elderly mare opened the door, blinking in the sunlight and scowling at her. Let me guess, the mare said without preamble. Princess got you running to Canterlot again. Hi, Mrs. Stacks, Twilight said. Yes, I'm afraid so. Could you watch the library again while I'm gone? Mrs. Stacks sighed and patted her iron grey mane, which was already arranged in its standard bun. How long this time? Hard to say. A few days, at least. I'll send a letter as soon as I know for sure. The old mare HM'd at her and scowled. You know, I thought when I retired as the town librarian, that would mean that I'd actually get to stay away from the library from time to time. Twilight's grin was both apologetic and a little impatient. The train would be coming soon, after all. I'm really sorry, Mrs. Stacks. When I get back, I can look into training some pony else to take over as backup, if you like. Worry flashed across the old mare's eyes, and her frown slackened just a little. No need, she said quickly, waving a hoof. Youngsters these days have no appreciation for books, anyway. She affected the long-suffering sigh that Twilight was almost positive was at least partially an act. I'll do it. You'd best be going. You look fit to burst, with the way your hooves are dancing. Twilight's awkward grin morphed into a pleased smile. Thank you, Mrs. Stacks. I'll send a letter as soon as I know more. Don't mention it, dear, Mrs. Stacks replied. Bye. Twilight said as her horn started glowing. A flash of magic later, and she had teleported half a block closer to the train station. Ark. Warn a guy when you do that, okay? Spike complained from his perch on her back. With all the practicing she'd gotten in recently, it was easy for Twilight to forget how disorienting a teleport could be when you weren't used to them, especially when somebody else was the one controlling the teleport. Sorry, Spike. I'm just eager to get to the train, is all. It's not even going to be here for, what, 4 minutes. Then they have to board every pony, which takes, quote. About 20 minutes for the arrivals to disembark and for the departing ponies to get on board. Another 10 minutes to pick up any stragglers, and then they're leaving. So, we have over 30 minutes before the train leaves. Why so panicky? Twilight rolled her eyes as she trotted along. Spike should know better than that. Because anything could go wrong, Spike. Honestly, if we could have been waiting an hour early, I would have been much happier. Besides, what if they leave early? Then they'd get a strongly worded letter from a certain purple unicorn regarding the importance of keeping to a schedule. Spike ventured. Twilight looked back at him and arched an eyebrow. Schedules are important, Spike. Besides, my coat is lavender. Looks purple to me, Spike said before yawning. I'm gonna close my eyes for a minute. Wake me when we get on the train, okay? Twilight chuckled. Sure, Spike. The rest of the trip was uneventful, for which Twilight was grateful. Spike had long since adapted to sleeping through nearly anything while on her back, but if he was startled awake, he had an unfortunate habit of deploying his claws and grabbing onto her coat. The ticket booth had a small line, which was another reason why Twilight had wanted to get here early. She didn't mind waiting, ordinarily, but she absolutely despised waiting in a line. With the constant shuffling forward, it was impossible to do something even as simple as read a book while waiting for her turn to buy a ticket. Fortunately, the line moved quickly. Twilight had just bought her ticket and made her way onto the platform when the train slowed to a stop with a screech of metal on metal. Naturally, this woke Spike with a start, and Twilight grimaced and tensed until the baby dragon relaxed enough to pull his needle-sharp claws out of her skin and fall back asleep. As the porters began unloading passengers and their baggage, Twilight's eye was drawn to a large peacock feather bobbing over the crowd. Her eyes followed the feather down, which showed that it was attached to a large, stylish hat. Under the hat was a very familiar face, which was also scanning the crowd. Rarity met Twilight's eyes, and both ponies broke into large smiles and began trotting towards each other, Rarity leaving her large pile of luggage behind her to be dealt with by several porters. Rarity. What are you doing here? The other unicorn snickered at that. It's nice to see you, too, Twilight. Twilight blushed at that. Well, yeah, sorry. Nice to see you, Rarity. Are you heading to Canterlot, too? Yes, it's quite the coincidence, isn't it? Rarity tossed her head and her elegantly styled mane bounced and swayed along with the peacock feather in her hat. Twilight had wondered on more than one occasion what it took for her friend to manage those curls every morning. Rarity, while keen on giving grooming and fashion advice, was strangely reluctant to go into the details of her own beauty routine. I've been invited, by no less than Fancy Pants himself, to consult on a new line of fashion accessories for ponies heading to Earth. Rarity's beaming smile lit up her face as she began hopping in place, the peacock feather bouncing wildly as she did so. Ooh, it's just so exciting. Twilight blinked, confused. While Rarity consulting on anything fashion-related didn't seem unusual, the fact that she was being asked for her input on something so specific was a little confusing. Twilight decided to try for some clarification. Fashion accessories for Earth. Yes, to replace the standard talk that every pony wears now. They're trying to store magic in everything from earrings to hair clips, tail bows and bracelets. Anything more fashionable and less obtrusive than the talks which, while lovely, are a bit unwieldy. Oh, I see. And Fancy Pants asked for you, specifically. Rarity positively glowed as she nodded. Oh, yes, it's wonderful having friends in high places, isn't it? Her smile faded slightly. Oh, but listen to me, going on all this time about me without even asking about you. I understand that the princess wanted you in Canterlot for a few days. Yes, that's right, Twilight replied with a nod. Didn't Spike mention why? I'm afraid not, Rarity said with a shake of her head. The poor dear burst into my boutique while I was in the midst of packing, blurted out his message, and was gone before I could even ask him how his day was. Twilight flinched at that, looking guiltily over her shoulder at her assistant, who was still asleep on her back and smiling at whatever dream he was having. The fact that Spike didn't even stay to exchange pleasantries with Rarity, of all ponies, suggested that he'd been in something of a panic trying to follow her instructions. Sorry, little guy, she murmured to the sleeping dragon. Even though she'd been summoned by Princess Celestia, Twilight determined right then and there that their first stop in Canterlot would be Donut Joe's Donut Shop. Spike deserved a treat for all he'd had to put up with today. To go, of course. He could eat on the way to the palace, provided he was careful not to get any crumbs on her coat. The two of them chatted for a while longer, up until they started boarding the train. Spike woke up on his own at that point, stared at Rarity for a few seconds, then started desperately running his hands over his head to make sure his spines were straight. Twilight giggled, but Rarity politely pretended not to notice. As the three of them sat together, talking and just enjoying each other's company, Twilight felt some of the tension she'd been carrying all morning begin to fade. From Spike's disappearance to the princess letter, she'd been feeling nothing but frazzled and on edge. But now, with the promise of a swift trip to Canterlot in the company of two good friends, she could finally begin to relax. Tilda *Erin*. Erin got back to her house a little after 5 in the afternoon. Her second round of grocery buying had netted her such staples as sliced bread, jelly, peanut butter, and assorted fruits. In addition, she bought a few boxes of dry pasta and some sauces in jars. Hopefully, boiling some water in a pot wouldn't prove too much of a strain on her culinary skills. She made her way to the bathroom once again in order to touch up her coat, mane and wings, since she didn't want to make a bad first impression on her neighbor. Well, third impression, if she was getting technical, but this would be her first time in Ditsy's home, and she wanted to be sure she was at her best. Then there was nothing to do but wait. Erin unplugged her tablet and broke out her hoof strap and stylus in order to play a few time-wasting games, mostly involving blowing up floating piles of fruit with slingshot-mounted bombs. She'd never really stopped to consider the logic of that, but it was a fun game. Her tablet's timer went off 5 minutes before she was due at Ditsy's house for dinner. She packed the tablet away, nabbed the box of pastries off of the counter and set it on her back before walking out of her front door. From the outside, Ditsy's house looked much like hers, a small, thatch-roofed house with a second floor that was about half the size of the first. The primary difference was that the siding was painted a light pink, with a bright yellow trim. Erin knocked gently on the door and then spent a busy few seconds running her hooves over Ditsy's welcome mat, trying to clear any dirt or debris off before her host opened the door. She was still at it when the door was flung open. "Hello," Ditsy said cheerfully. "Hi," Erin said as she looked up. Then she froze. One of Ditsy's eyes was looking right at her, but the other one was looking up and to the left. After a moment of staring, Erin forced a smile, desperately hoping that Ditsy hadn't noticed. It wasn't meant to be. The Pegasus chuckled and pointed a hoof at her right eye. "Oh, this. Sorry, that happens sometimes when I'm tired or distracted. I should have warned you. Some ponies find it a little unnerving. Hold on, I can fix it." Ditsy frowned and blinked a few times in rapid succession, all while Erin was babbling, "Oh, no, it doesn't bother me." "Ah, there we go," Ditsy said, smiling. She looked at Erin, now with both eyes facing in the right direction. "How's that? Much better." Erin's own eyes widened, then. "Not that it was bad before. I mean." Ditsy's joyful laugh cut her off. "Don't worry about it. I've had this condition my whole life. It doesn't bother me anymore, as long as ponies don't tease me about it. Come on in." Ditsy stepped aside, and Erin began walking through the door. "Who would tease you about that?" she asked, feeling a little disturbed. Ponies always seemed to be so nice. Mean-spirited teasing seemed wrong, and out of character. With a shrug, Ditsy just said, "Foals can be cruel, sometimes. Oh, speaking of foals, Dinky is out playing with some friends. She should be home soon." She pointed a hoof at the box on Erin's back. "Are those the pastries? I'll grab them, if that's okay." Erin nodded, and Ditsy took the box in her teeth before planting it on her own back. Then she trotted off towards the kitchen, which Erin noticed was in the same location as her own. "Make yourself at home. I'm just going to pull the casserole out of the oven and get the salad ready." "Okay," Erin called before looking around. Now that she'd gotten a closer look, it was obvious that Ditsy's house was built with the same floor plan as Erin's. Which likely meant a bathroom, largish bedroom and living room on the first floor, and a smaller bedroom upstairs with its own half bathroom. That was where the similarities ended. Erin's own home was well maintained but sparse in its decorating and furnishing, largely due to her having just moved in. Ditsy's home was well worn and obviously lived in. The living area was arranged so that several ponies could all relax and talk together, dominated by a large, somewhat faded and threadbare red couch facing two smaller, matching chairs with a coffee table in the middle. One smaller, non-matching chair was obviously for Ditsy's daughter Dinky, considering that the small end table next to it was loaded with coloring books. Next to the books was a green-painted tin can that held a variety of crayons and colored pencils. Erin wandered through the living room, noticing the rug that covered most of the sitting area. It was a sky blue, with patterns of fluffy white clouds. It would have been lovely, if it weren't for the occasional colorful stain, ranging from deep reds to purples to, for some reason, bright green. Erin assumed the redder stains were probably from juice spills but, for the life of her, she couldn't figure out the bright green one. The fireplace was almost identical to Erin's, except for the childlike scrawling and stick figure ponies on some of the lower bricks. On the mantelpiece were framed photos, mostly showing a lavender unicorn filly with a blonde mane mugging at the camera. Erin guessed that this must be Dinky, and also noticed that the filly had a fondness for making silly faces. Out of all the pictures the filly featured in, only 3 had her smiling normally. 2 of those pictures also had a smiling Ditsy in them, the mother and daughter posing for the camera with Ditsy holding her daughter to her side with a wing. The third featured both Ditsy and Dinky, as well as a third, older mare, which Erin guessed to be Ditsy's mother, judging by the family resemblance. There were toys on the floor, Erin noticed, though they were all tucked behind the furniture. Pony ragdolls, balls, blocks and even some jacks, which Erin made sure to steer clear of. She'd stepped on jacks with bare feet before, and she had no intention of repeating the experience with hooves. There were a lot of blocks, Erin noticed. In the back corner of the room was a carefully created little town made of wooden blocks in various shapes and sizes, with small wooden pony figures standing in the streets. It was rough, and none of the buildings had roofs. Right then, Erin decided to buy a bucket of Legos for the filly, to see if that was something she'd like. It would be something else for Ditsy to avoid stepping on, but if the filly liked building things that much, then Erin was sure she'd appreciate the gift. Just then, the front door opened. Erin looked up just in time to see the little filly in question walking through the front door. Her heart caught in her throat as she saw who was walking in behind her. "Moon." Dinky called. "I'm in the kitchen," came the reply. "Can I have a friend over for dinner, too? We already checked with her mom and it's okay." "Sure, fine by me as long as you two behave yourselves," Ditsy called back. "You want to help me set up the table? Your friend can wait in the living room with Erin." "Sure." Dinky trotted off towards the kitchen. Her guest, a unicorn filly with a golden coat and dark brown mane, looked around uncertainly for a moment before walking into the living room. Erin backed away, trying to get some moisture back into her mouth as her heart began pounding. The movement brought the filly's light green eyes onto her, which widened in shock. "Sunflower," the filly said, the shock plainly evident in her voice. Erin's mouth hung open for a few seconds before an involuntary smile started growing. Chapter 10. Dinner with Ditsy Do. Tilda asterisk Erin asterisk tilde. Sunflower. Marigold cried as she launched herself forward. Erin froze a moment before being hit in the knee by a cannonball of filly cuteness. Marigold clamped on like a limpet, all while a rapid-fire flow of words poured out of her mouth. You're here. Mommy said you were gone. And you were a who, ma'am? And that you went back to Earth. Wide, liquid eyes gazed up at her, and Erin's heart started to melt a little. Are you really a who, ma'am? You can change shape. Can you teach me how? Is that why you have a horn? And wings? Why do you have wings? When are you coming back home? That last question hit Erin right in the heart, leaving her feeling shaken and vulnerable. She sat down heavily as the strength went out of her hind legs, with Marigold still clinging tenaciously to a foreleg. A noise from the dining area caught her attention, and she glanced up to see Ditsy and Dinky both in the dining room and looking back at the pair of them. Dinky was staring with her mouth open, while Ditsy just had a small, confused smile on her face. I take it that you two have met before? Ditsy asked, her face crinkling into a grin as she put a large salad bowl on the dining room table. Yeah, Erin said faintly as her brain played catch up. She noticed that she was absently ruffling Marigold's mane and drew her hoof back sharply as if she'd touched something hot. I stayed at the Ponyville guest house for a few weeks when I first came here. She smiled awkwardly down at the wide-eyed little filly who was still clamped onto her leg. I used to babysit Marigold, here. The filly in question was frowning, though she didn't let go of Erin's leg. She poked Erin in the chest with her stubby horn. You aren't answering my questions, she said with a pout. In Erin's heart, a near-frantic desperation was building. Marigold's mother Meadowlark had said in no uncertain terms that Erin wasn't to associate with her daughter without her around. As much as Erin wanted to hug the filly, she knew that any contact with Marigold without her mom's approval could torpedo any chances she had of reconciliation with her first real friend in Ponyville. Marigold tightened her grip a little, and Erin realized that she'd been unconsciously trying to pull away. Erin hid a grimace. For now, at least, she was stuck. Unless she wanted to forcibly remove the filly from her leg. No matter what Meadowlark might have wanted, that simply wasn't something Erin was willing to do. Well, which one do you want me to answer first? Erin asked with a weak grin. The filly's brow furrowed as she thought about it seriously, a tiny frown etching its way across her features. Finally, she decided on her first question. Are you really a who, ma'am? It's human, sweetie, Erin said, glancing up to see that Ditsy had once again disappeared into the kitchen, though Dinky was still standing there and staring with wide eyes. And, yes, I am. You look like a pony, though, Dinky said, earning her a very serious look from Marigold. You can talk to her after I'm done asking questions, Dinky, Marigold said bluntly. No fair. Dinky whined. Marigold ignored her as she turned her head to look back up at Erin. Are you coming back home? Ah. Well, if you mean to Ponyville, then yes. If you mean to the guest house, then no. I have another place in town. Where? Erin stopped herself from answering right away. Marigold was just the type of filly to start dropping by without her mom's approval. She gave it some thought before saying, I'll tell you what, maybe I can invite you and your mom over soon, and you can see. Okay. That got a rare smile out of the typically serious filly, who finally let go of Erin's leg. Okay. Mama said she lives next door, Dinky supplied helpfully. Marigold threw a questioning look her way. Really? Erin sighed and deflated a little. Yeah, I do. Ditsy's call of dinner's ready. Cut off any further questions for the moment. Marigold looked at the table, then back at Erin, obviously torn. Why don't you go and have a seat with Dinky, Marigold? Erin said. I have to talk to Ditsy for a minute, okay? Ditsy raised an eyebrow at that, but allowed Erin to lead her back into the kitchen. In spite of the nauseating worry Erin was feeling, a small part of her couldn't help but look around with interest and take some notes on how Ditsy's kitchen was arranged. The walls of Ditsy's kitchen were painted a cheery dandelion yellow, with green vines painted along the trim. Pots and pans hung from a rack that was bolted onto the wall across from the oven, which was a more beat-up version of the one Erin had in her own home. There was a large spice rack on the counter, a huge green mixer, and various other small appliances and utensils. On one wall was a framed piece of flower pattern fabric that had the message, Mom's special ingredient is love, embroidered into it. On the doorframe leading to the dining room were a series of marks, the highest of which had Dinky, age 6 inches, scrawled next to it. A refrigerator coated with Dinky's school papers and drawings completed the look of a busy but well-tended kitchen. So, I take it something is wrong? Ditsy asked quietly once they were out of range of the filly's hearing. And it has to do with Marigold, if I'm any judge. Erin grimaced and nodded. You can say that. She took a deep breath before just diving in. Meadowlark was furious when she found out I was a human. Well, that and horrified. Ah. I see. Ditsy's voice was sympathetic enough, but Erin still flinched. I talked to her a while back, and she still hadn't forgiven me for lying. Erin poured a hoof at the well-scrubbed tiles of Ditsy's kitchen floor. She kind of, well, forbade me from seeing her daughter without her around. Ditsy blinked, and her right eye went askew for a couple of seconds before snapping back into alignment. Why, I mean, we all know humans aren't really dangerous, right? Erin cleared her throat awkwardly. Well, there's good and bad humans, but yeah, we're kind of like ponies that way. But, for all she knew at the time, I could have been some horrifying brain-eating alien predator. Ditsy snorted and covered her muzzle with a hoof, though her shaking wings gave away the chuckle she was trying to smother. She cleared her throat and actually managed to look serious. So, Meadowlark doesn't want you around her daughter because you're an alien and she doesn't trust you now. Something like that. Erin shrugged. It's complicated. She sighed and added, I really shouldn't be here. I hate to do this, but I probably need to take a rain check on dinner. Ditsy tilted her head quizzically. Why, I mean, I'm here. I'll make sure you don't go slurping up any filly brains for dessert. Erin snickered in spite of herself. Well, that's what I brought those pastries over for, to curb any brain-slurping impulses I might have had. Ditsy laughed at that, and Erin couldn't help but join in. They were interrupted by a small, almost scared voice coming from the doorway to the dining room. Is everything okay? Marigold asked as she peeked around the doorframe. You aren't leaving, are you? Erin felt her heart melting once again and opened her mouth to say the hardest thing she could imagine at that moment before Ditsy cut her off. Of course she's staying, the Pegasus said. We just had to have a little talk before dinner, that's all. Erin looked over at Ditzy with a mix of trepidation and hope. I don't know. It's going to be okay, Ditzy said quietly in her ear. I'm pretty sure I can talk some sense into Meadowlark. Between Ditzy's assurances and Marigold's soulful stare, it was simply too much. Erin sighed and nodded. I'm staying. Marigold offered up another of her rare smiles and did a little shuffling dance with her forehooves. Yes. Tilde asterisk Twilight asterisk tilde. In spite of Spike's best efforts to stay awake once the train had started moving, the rhythmic click-clack of the rails had gotten him drowsing less than 5 minutes out of Ponyville. Soon, he was curled up and fast asleep, snoring away in his typically adorable way, with his right thumb in his mouth and his left hand grabbing a hold of his tail. This left Rarity and Twilight to talk, which was a minor tragedy for the dragon but just fine with Twilight. Rarity had been extremely busy recently, and Twilight had missed having one-on-one time with her fashionable friend. So, Twilight, I have something to show you, Rarity said. Her horn glowed, opening her saddlebags and removing a rectangular pouch of purple velvet that matched her mane and tail. After a quick tug on the drawstrings at the top, the velvet fell away, revealing Rarity's tablet. They really were a wonderful-looking design, Twilight reflected as she admired the glossy white of Rarity's tablet, along with the stunning blue diamonds painted on the back. Though, looking at her friend's tablet reminded Twilight of something she'd forgotten. Oh, drat. I forgot my own tablet at the library. Rarity made a comforting noise and patted her on the leg. I'm so sorry to hear that, dear. I'm surprised, though. Usually, you triple-check your bags before leaving on a trip. I reused an old packing checklist for efficiency's sake, Twilight groused. I forgot to put the tablet on it. Her horn lit up and pulled a small notebook out of her own saddlebag, along with a quill and ink. What are you doing? Rarity asked. Writing a note on my to-do list to update all of my old checklists, Twilight said, a scowl of concentration on her features as she wrote. There, all done. She tapped the feather of her quill against her chin. I should probably make that a weekly task. Another note was scribbled into the notebook, which was left open on the seat for the ink to dry while the quill and inkwell were tucked back into Twilight's saddlebags. Well, I'm glad we've gotten that out of the way, Rarity said with a wry smile. I'm a little disappointed, though. Oh. Yes, well. I was thinking that we could show each other what we'd discovered with regards to our tablets. Erin can only stretch so far, after all. Rarity offered a broad smile. We'll all need to compare notes in order to truly learn how to use these. Twilight nodded with an irritated grunt. It's a useful tool, that's for sure. Who knows how we'll end up using it? Well, Rarity cleared her throat and leaned forward with her eyes gleaming. Would you like to see what I've discovered so far? Sure. Twilight watched with interest as Rarity first pressed a hoof on the power button in the corner, causing the screen to glow. Then she cleared her throat delicately. Oh, Francois, darling, could you wake up, please? Twilight's momentary confusion was washed away when the tablet answered in a heavily accented voice that was both husky and smooth at the same time, while also being extremely masculine. Oui, Mademoiselle Rarity, the tablet crooned. How may I assist you? Rarity giggled delightedly. Oh, isn't he lovely? Twilight cleared her throat awkwardly, hoping that the electric tingle that had raced down her spine at the sound of the tablet's voice hadn't been too obvious. I don't recall hearing that voice in the selection. Rarity pressed a hoof under her chin while she considered. I believe it was romantic French accent, male. Oh. I avoided that one because I thought it would be in French, which is the human version of French, neither of which I speak. Twilight muttered. She didn't mention that the thought of reviewing a voice with a description of romantic had sounded far too silly the previous day. Then again, Erin did say that she could change the voices, if she wanted. Though, it would probably be pretty awkward if she used the same voice on her own tablet. So, what did you find out? I spent all of my time looking at the books that Erin had put on mine. That caused another pang of regret at leaving her tablet behind. The books it contained had all been fascinating, and she'd planned on reading one or two of them on the train ride both to and from Canterlot. Rarity's laugh was like the tinkling of bells. Of course you did, Twilight. However, I found something that I believe may be quite useful in my line of work. Francois, dear, could you open the drawing application? Oui, mademoiselle, came the deep, silky voice. I would be most pleased to do so. Rarity tapped on the screen a few times with the stylus that she had suspended in her magic. As it turns out, this lovely application allows me to sketch quite freely. Ah, here we are. Rarity turned the tablet, and Twilight saw an absolutely gorgeous dress sketched out and colored in, though the colors looked flat and artificial. Ooh, that's amazing, Twilight said as she leaned forward to get a better look. And, apparently, I can save each drawing before moving on to the next. Why, I could carry all of my designs with me all the time. Twilight smiled at Rarity, who seemed positively giddy at the thought. That's wonderful, though, you may want to be careful. If you had all of your designs on there and then lost or damaged. Francois, then you could lose it all at once. Rarity's head drew back and her ears flattened. Oh, my goodness, perished the thought. That would be dreadful. Maybe Erin can help with that, Twilight suggested. I remember her saying something about being able to print things out from the tablets. I bet she could make you paper copies of anything you draw on there. Do you really think so? Rarity's ears lifted and she smiled. Oh, I'll have to be sure to ask her as soon as I return to Ponyville. Rarity happily showed Twilight a few more designs she'd come up with, as well as how she applied color to the drawing itself. There were many options with the application that Rarity either hadn't noticed or simply chose not to experiment with yet, Twilight noted. It made sense, though. Nopony would just pick up something so complex and be able to do everything they wanted on it all at once. It would take time to get familiar with it. After that, the tablet went back into its pouch and into Rarity's saddlebag. The two friends passed the time in idle chit-chat until the train pulled into Canterlot. Twilight put her saddlebags back on, levitated the still sleeping Spike onto her back, and exited the train with Rarity at her side. Poor Spike, Rarity said as they stood on the platform. He must be all worn out. That's what he gets for trying to stay up all night watching movies. Twilight nudged him in the shoulder with her nose. Wake up, sleepyhead. We're here. Spike came awake slowly and looked around with bleary confusion before a shock of understanding washed over his face. Oh, no, I slept through the whole train ride. That you did, Spike. Rarity reached out a hoof and ruffled his spines. You were adorable. Spike blushed crimson and looked away, muttering something that Twilight couldn't quite understand. Are you going to be all right here on your own, Rarity? Twilight glanced at a nearby clock. I'd offer to stay, but the princess awaits. Rarity flashed a brilliant smile. I know, darling, you look like you're about to fly apart at the seams. She waved a hoof in a shooing motion, though her smile never wavered. Go on, I'll be fine. I'll hire a porter and a cab and be in my hotel within an hour, at most. Twilight sagged slightly with relief. Thanks, Rarity. I really do have to get going. I won't keep you, then, Rarity said as she drew Twilight into a hug. Please give the princesses my regards, would you? Of course. I'll stop by your hotel after I find out what the princess wants, all right. Rarity broke the hug and smiled once again. I look forward to it, dear. Farewell. Later, Rarity. Twilight waved, and Spike mumbled a farewell of his own while waving from her back. They hadn't even reached the gateway that led out to the street before Spike spoke up. Maybe I could stay with Rarity and give her a hand, Spike ventured. I mean, I doubt you'll need me with Princess Celestia, and Rarity has all that luggage. 20 seconds, Twilight said. It was a new record for him. Usually, he tried to come up with an excuse to stick with Rarity much sooner. Either he was learning restraint, or he was still a little groggy from his nap. Twilight was betting on the latter. What? Never mind. Anyway, if you help out Rarity, then you won't be able to go to Donut Joe's with me. That got the little guy's attention. Spike sat up straight on her back with a gasp. We're going to Donut Joe. Really? Yup. Why? Twilight looked back at him with a single raised eyebrow, and he held up his hands defensively. Not that I'm saying we shouldn't, he said frantically. It's just a little out of the blue, you know. It's a reward for all your hard work, Twilight said. I know I don't say it enough, but I am really proud of you, Spike. Spike's face lit up like a beacon. Gosh, thanks, Twilight. You bet, Spike. They trotted along for a few seconds before a cautious voice drifted from Spike's general direction. So, does this mean that I get my tablet back, now? Twilight laughed. Don't push it, buddy. Ah. Tilda asterisk Mikael Rost asterisk tilde. The meeting with Dr. Maggie Henson hadn't been as comfortable as Mikael had hoped it would be. The stout older scientist had welcomed him with aloof politeness and then almost immediately offered to take him to his lab. In spite of his longer stride, he had to step quickly to keep up with Dr. Henson as she led him through the seemingly endless maze of the harmonics compound. He pulled the sample of black tide along behind him in its trunk, which, he decided, was a large factor as to why it was hard for him to keep up. So, why here, Dr. Rost? Dr. Maggie Henson asked after a minute or two of walking. She slowed down slightly, allowing him to catch up and speak more easily. Well, mostly for the view and the lovely mountain air. Dr. Henson favored him with a frosty scowl which indicated that, just perhaps, flippancy wasn't the best course of action. He cleared his throat and attempted to inject some humility into his voice. Coming here wasn't my first choice, but I need Dr. Edwards. His work with cybernetics is leagues ahead of anyone else's. Dr. Henson's scowl twisted sourly as she nodded. And Tom isn't the type to want to leave the lab he spent the last year building from scratch. An obvious effort of will on Maggie's part smoothed her features over. I'm just a little worried, is all. Mikael held a hand before him in a placating gesture. Look, I understand the squeamishness when it comes to studying it, but you have to understand. There's literally tons of Tide material left in the scar, and we still know so little about it. Heck, they just uncovered an intact chunk of it the size of 2 Olympic-sized swimming pools. Maggie snorted at that. I wasn't aware that we'd adopted Olympic swimming pool as the standard unit of measurement. Now it was Mikael who had a frown on his face. You know what I mean, Dr. Henson. I do. And, for what it's worth, I agree. Maggie sighed and ran a hand through her graying hair. Though, most of those studying it are content to remain near the scar itself. That's not why I'm worried. I'm just worried that you're doing it here, of all places. What's wrong with here? Mikael asked. State-of-the-art facilities, a good distance away from populated areas, independent power sources. Top minds in genetics, engineering, cybernetics and nanotechnology call this facility home. Not to mention harmonics, Ascent, and the cybernetics unit. You know what those are, Doctor. Eggs in a basket. Maggie sighed again. We've got too many of them here. And now we have your little project in the mix, as well. We're a single good disaster from losing years of scientific advancement, not to mention our contact with the Equestrians. I thought the backup site in Scotland was ready. We shouldn't have to worry about losing contact with Equestria anytime soon. The Canole Hill site is still a few weeks away from completion, Maggie replied shortly. So, what is it that you're doing differently? Everyone else is studying the chemical or structural makeup of the thing, but I have a different direction I want to go, Mikael said as he unconsciously leaned towards her enthusiastically. The Tide looks a little bit like brain tissue. The most common hypothesis as to why is that it was a gigantic semi-organic computer. Computers hold data. If I can interface with it somehow, I might be able to read the data. His eyes gleamed as he smiled. Imagine what we could learn. Not in the least where the damned thing came from. Dr. Henson shook her head. This seems incredibly unwise, but Bob is the boss, and he said to give you what you need. Just consider yourself lucky that he was able to scavenge some Tide-specific lab equipment from another site, or there's no way we would have gotten your lab set up by now. The corridor ended abruptly in a secured door. Maggie waved her badge over the card reader and pushed it open, revealing daylight and fresh air. Mikael followed uncertainly, dragging the trunk over the short, patchy grass. Ah, where are we going? He asked, breaking the silence. There, Maggie said, pointing. The windowless building looked to be about 40 feet long on each side and was made of heavy grey cinder block. The low, flat roof and plain design made the whole thing look squat and ugly. To top it all off, it was only about 20 feet away from the huge concrete wall that surrounded the entire harmonics compound. That's going to be my lab, Mikael asked flatly, unable to keep the disdain out of his voice at the sight of it. You got it. We were originally building it as a storage area. Just got done with the exterior about 3 weeks ago, actually. Maggie jerked a thumb over to the left of the building, indicating a bulldozer, a backhoe, a front loader and several bobcat tractors scattered about in the large open area between the building and the perimeter wall that surrounded the whole compound. Even with most of the lab equipment pre-built off-site, we barely got this done in time. Dr. Henson took out a key and unlocked the steel door. She then held out the key to Mikkel, who took it with the same enthusiasm he would have had if it had been a dead fish. I've got to say, I was expecting better than this, Dr. Henson, Mikkel said as he pocketed the key. I was expecting to be in a lab that was at least connected to the rest of the compound. Too dangerous, Maggie said dismissively as she ran her hand along the wall. Besides, I think you'll be pleasantly surprised. Ah, there we go. She flicked the lights on, flooding the interior of the building with a bright light. The interior was covered with soft white wall panels, similar to the beige panels of the main harmonics compound. If the lab followed the same standards as the rest of the facility, then the panels were removable, to allow easy access to wiring, plumbing and ventilation. Immediately after the doorway was a small ramp that led up to a raised floor of pristine white panels. The drop ceiling above had still more panels, which seemed to almost glow softly in the fluorescent lights. I feel like I just walked into Aperture Labs, Mikkel said wryly. When Dr. Henson treated him to a blank look, he added, the Portal Games. Ah, they had a lot of panels, he finished lamely. Maggie grunted and walked forward up the short ramp. Mikkel followed, dragging his trunk behind him. That's where you'll be storing your sample at all times, Maggie said, pointing. Mikkel looked, letting out an involuntary whistle. A cube, about 8 feet on each side and made primarily of what looked like thick glass, dominated the center of the room. The top of it was sided in steel that extended up into the drop ceiling. The glass bottom of the cage rested not on a raised floor, but on still more steel. On each wall of the cube there were controls that linked up to robotic arms that were retracted up against the roof. A pedestal holding a large plexiglass bowl stood in the center of the cube, looking just about the right size to hold his sample of the tide. The pedestal was surrounded by a larger, barrel-looking device. After he'd gotten his fill of looking at the cube, he glanced around the rest of the lab with quiet satisfaction. Along the wall to his left were large lockers, and desks with glowing computer screens already fired up. To his right was a utility sink, 2 emergency safety showers, and other equipment that Mikkel couldn't be bothered to take in right away. We had to hurry to build this, and containment was our top priority. So, if you need any further equipment, let us know, Dr. Henson said. The lab is yours to do with as you please, with the exception of the safety protocols. You will not violate these protocols, do you understand? Dr. Henson fixed him with a glare that immediately put Mikkels back up. He swallowed back his initial reply. Instead, he nodded. I got it. Here's a quick rundown of the most important points. 1. The tide sample will stay on the pedestal, Maggie said, confirming his suspicions. You can use the control panels to lower it into the containment system at any time. That barrel contains liquid nitrogen. Whenever you're not actively working on the tide, you're required to keep it frozen. That rankled a bit, but it wasn't anything Mikkel hadn't expected. Understood. You see those cameras in the corners of the lab? He hadn't. He'd been too focused on the containment cage. I do now, he said. There will be a security guard monitoring the lab at all times, Maggie said. His outrage must have shown, because she held up a hand to forestall whatever it was he was going to say. Non-negotiable, Doctor. If you somehow manage to reactivate this sample, you may be compromised too quickly to hit the alarms. Mikkel's voice was tight and angry. This sample doesn't have any nanomachines on it. It's been checked. Really? She said flatly. You've checked the entire 20 pounds of it for microscopic machines, and you're 100% sure you didn't miss a single one. The sardonic tone of voice didn't do anything to calm him down. The Tide's nanomachines relied on a signal to activate them, he said. The damned equestrian princesses themselves even said so. That signal has stopped. Maggie crossed her arms and raised an eyebrow. And if it starts again? Unlikely. But we'd have plenty of time to get it back into the nitrogen, I'm sure, Mikkel said stiffly. I'm glad you're confident, but I'm more concerned with the sample attacking you directly. What do you mean? It's a blob of semi-organic brain-like tissue. No musculature. Dr. Henson's eyes narrowed and her mouth set into a firm line. First of all, I don't usually explain myself like this. Consider it a gift to the newbie. Second, you didn't see what it did to Princess Celestia. Dr. Henson shuddered. I did. The Tide has been shown to have some sort of abilities that some might call psychic. If you somehow manage to activate this thing and it does something to affect your mind, it could render you helpless before you can do anything to stop it. I think you're greatly overestimating its abilities, he said. Maggie stared at him for a long moment. Are we going to have a disagreement here, Dr. Rost? Because I'm more than happy to shut all this down and send you packing. Mikkel knew he only had one trump card, but at least it was a doozy. Robert Thompson. He's the one who told me to set up the security as I see fit, Maggie interrupted. If I tell him you're not playing ball and had to shut you down, he'll back me. Apparently, his trump card wasn't quite the doozy he'd thought it was. He stared at Dr. Henson for a few moments. If she was bluffing, she had the best poker face he'd ever seen. He held up his hands in surrender. All right, I understand. He offered what he hoped was a sincere smile and added, I'm not used to working in situations like this, is all. Dr. Henson grunted. If you hated that, you're really going to hate this next bit. Mikkel braced himself, struggling with his temper. Making peace was important, he reminded himself. Once he was established, he could push at the boundaries. For now, he needed to at least have Dr. Henson's tolerance, if he couldn't manage her outright approval. And what's that? Every person who goes into or out of this lab is going to be subject to a mandatory weekly CAT scan and checkup. To discount any chance of mental manipulation from the Tide. Are you serious? Again, not negotiable. I'm taking no chances, Doctor, remember. He exchanged a somewhat heated glare with her for a few seconds before dropping his gaze. Anything else? He asked, hating the sullen tone to his voice. A couple of things. 1. See those nozzles in the ceiling of the cage. Mikkel looked, spotting several devices that looked like larger than average fire suppression sprinklers, though they were made of acrylic rather than metal. Yes. In the event of any kind of containment breach, enough hydrochloric acid to fill the cage is going to be dumped down from the ceiling in a matter of seconds. That can be triggered here in the lab, or remotely from the security office. So, what you're saying is that my work is going to be at the mercy of a security guard, who may or may not have an itchy trigger finger. If Mikkel's outraged sarcasm had any impact, Dr. Henson's face didn't show it. Instead, she nodded. That's not all. Check the corners. Mikkel did so, noting for the first time that large metal and plastic pylons were attached at each corner of the lab. What are those? Dr. Henson's face didn't have any trace of humor as she locked her eyes on his. Harmonics emitters, she said, her tone deadly serious. In the event of a full breach, if the acid doesn't do its work, they will be triggered before the tide can compromise the entire facility. Harmonics, Mikkel felt a little weak in the legs as the realization hit him. Where do they go? Not Equestria, I'm assuming. Dr. Henson shook her head. In the case of a full breach, security will trigger the emitters, which are hardwired to rip open a gateway to the world we call Hades. This entire lab will be dumped there, and then the gateway closed. You'll want to be out of the lab before that happens. That world is extremely active, volcanically. The atmosphere is incredibly toxic, with heavy concentrations of sulfuric acid. If the tide doesn't kill you, then Hades will, and it won't be pleasant. Mikkel took in Dr. Henson's expression. She was somber but determined, resolve etched in every line of her face. In a flash of insight, Mikkel realized that she would hate herself for the rest of her life if anyone was still in the lab when she ordered the emitters to be triggered, and that still wouldn't make her hesitate for even a second. A cold fear froze his chest. This entire lab was a death trap. It was also his best chance to tap whatever information was held in the tide. A fierce battle between ambition and fear warred within him for a few seconds before he smiled cheerfully. Well, then. I'd better hope I'm right, and that this sample is as harmless as I think it is. He doubted that the falsely chipper tone in his voice fooled Maggie for 1 second. Still, she smiled back. I certainly hope so too, she said, holding out a hand. Welcome aboard, Dr. Rost. He only hesitated a moment before reaching out and taking her hand. She would kill him in an instant, if the situation demanded it. It was absurd enough for him to laugh. Glad to be here, Dr. Henson. Tilda asterisk Twilight asterisk Tilda. Thank you, Twilight Sparkle said to the guard as they let her and Spike into Celestia's private study. The guard nodded, keeping a stoic expression on his face that remained until Spike passed a donut over to him. He blinked and took it in his magic out of reflex. Enjoy, dude, Spike said before taking another donut out of the box for himself. The doors closed behind him as the baffled guard considered his chocolate donut. Twilight smiled and rolled her eyes at Spike's antics. He'd been pretty happy the whole way to the palace, though he'd likely ruined his appetite by now. Princess Celestia was seated on several dark red cushions piled up on the floor. She glanced up from her desk as they came in and broke into a warm smile as soon as she saw them. Twilight, Spike. So good of you to come. Princess Celestia stood and embraced Twilight with a wing. Of course, Princess, Twilight said as she leaned into Celestia's coat. Twilight was never sure if Celestia wore perfume, but the scent of her was familiar and comforting, like some warm grass and wildflowers on a summer's day. Celestia broke the embrace and indicated a low table in the center of her study, which already contained a teapot and several glasses, as well as a plate of scones and cookies. Please, relax and help yourselves. Ooh, Spike said as he hopped off of her back. Twilight's magic snagged him just before he grabbed a cookie. Ah. Hold on, there, greedy guts, Twilight said. You had a bunch of donuts on the way over, remember? Only 4, Twilight. That's still enough sweets, Twilight scolded. You're going to be sick. Celestia chuckled, reminding Twilight that she was supposed to be here talking to the princess. Blushing, she removed her saddlebags and put them down near the table, in order to have easy access to them if needed. The box of donuts went next to them. She sat, and Spike sat next to her, grumbling. How was the trip out? Princess Celestia asked as she sat down. It was nice. I forgot to bring my tablet, though. Celestia raised an eyebrow as she poured some tea into her cup. Tablet, oh, yes. Erin bought a tablet for me, Twilight said. For our other friends, too. Including me. Spike added with a big grin. Celestia chuckled softly. Human technology is spreading, I see. I'm afraid I haven't used mine very much. But you can do so many things with it, Twilight said eagerly. Like, read books, and there's a calculator, and you can draw with it. And movies. Spike added. Movies, too, Twilight acknowledged. And you can keep books on it. You said that already, Spike noted. Twilight blushed. Well, it's important, Celestia smiled. Perhaps I should take another look at mine. Still, that's not why I've asked you here, Twilight. This was it. Twilight put her teacup down on the table and braced herself, making herself ready for whatever it was the princess needed. Why did you ask me here, princess? Celestia looked away, a tiny smile curling the corners of her mouth. Twilight followed her gaze and saw that she was looking in the direction of her private apartments, which were attached to this study by large oak doors. I've been ruling over Equestria for well over 1,000 years. I know that most ponies believe that I can do practically anything. Celestia turned her head and met Twilight's eyes, still smiling that gentle smile. The truth is, though, that I'm still only one mare. I have a limited amount of time, and no amount of experience or magical power can change that. If I am to spend the proper amount of time caring for Prince Verdant, I've got to make some difficult choices. And, after careful consideration, what I've decided is that I should turn over the majority of my duties to Princess Luna. The last statement seemed to stop time itself. Spike was frozen in the act of stealing a cookie off of the tray. Twilight, herself, was stuck in place like a fly in amber. She began to feel lightheaded, which confused her until she realized that she was holding her breath. You're retiring? Twilight asked. The room seemed to vibrate around her as one of the very pillars of Equestria shook. That can't be right. She let out a high-pitched laugh. I must have heard you wrong. Celestia just looked at her with kindness etched on every feature. Or, it's a joke. It's a joke, right? I mean, I can't remember you ever playing a joke on me before, but it's possible. So, you're playing a joke on me, because you wouldn't ever step down and stop being a princess, because you're Princess Celestia, and you can't just stop being that. It's absurd. So, it must be a joke, right? Twilight's desperate grin melted in the face of Celestia's compassionate expression. The world around her shook again. It's not a joke. Breathe, Twilight, Spike said urgently next to her. You've got to breathe. Twilight looked down and saw his concerned face staring up at her. She also noticed that she was holding her tail in her lap and was petting it anxiously, which she forced herself to stop doing. I'm not retiring, Twilight, Celestia said softly. Yes, I'm turning over most of my responsibilities to Luna, but only for a few years. The time will fly by, I'm certain. Twilight latched onto the statement of only a few years, like a drowning mare with a life preserver. How many years? I think 5 will do, though that may change if circumstances do. Celestia leaned forward, looking at her intently. So, Twilight, I now come to the favor I must ask you. Anything, Princess, Twilight blurted instantly, though she knew that was a conditioned response. Pure reflex, without engaging her higher functions, necessitated by the fact that those higher functions were currently engaged with whirling and reeling like a ship in a storm. She felt like some pony had disabled gravity, and she wasn't able to find purchase. She looked into Celestia's eyes and immediately started feeling calmer. Whatever else changed, Celestia was there. Celestia was an anchor. No matter what changed in the world, she could always count on the princess. Twilight cleared her throat and stated with certainty, whatever you need from me, Princess Celestia, I'll do it. Her mind raced ahead, making a list of the things that the princess might need of her. Do you need administrative help? Organizational skills? Perhaps you'll need some pony to look up relevant laws or help draft new ones. Celestia chuckled and shook her head, sending waves cascading down her flowing mane. None of those things, Twilight. We have a considerable number of highly competent staff in place already. In fact, Luna will be getting several of my own staff, including 2 of my personal secretaries, to help her. No, I have something much more important for you to do. Twilight nodded and managed to sit up even straighter, somehow. What is it? Luna will have all the advisors she needs. All the clerks, guards, servants, everything required to help her run the country. She'll even have me as her primary advisor. However, there's one thing that she'll need that not even I can give her. Celestia reached across the table and placed her hoof on Twilight's. She needs a friend. A friend? Twilight asked, blinking. Celestia nodded. You got to know Luna last nightmare night, didn't you? When Twilight nodded hurriedly, Celestia continued. I can't tell you how happy I was to hear that. Luna has never been good at meeting new ponies, and returning after a 1,000-year absence hasn't made it any easier for her. The princess gave her an earnest look. She needs some pony who will give her a sympathetic ear whenever she needs it, who will give advice and listen to her problems. I can do that to a degree, but I'm still her big sister. Some of the problems she faces may very well come from me. Can I ask you to be her friend? Twilight stared, confused, at Celestia's heartfelt expression. No, she said. Spike gasped next to her, and she hurried to add, because friendship doesn't work that way, I mean. I'll be her friend because I already am, not because you ask me to. Celestia blinked, and Twilight felt the world wobble once again when she realized that she'd somehow managed to surprise the princess. A smile rose like a sunrise across Celestia's features. Thank you, Twilight, she said, bowing her head slightly. The bow had been too much. Twilight blushed and looked away, mumbling, don't mention it. She drew a circle on the table with her hoof and stared blankly at her tea for a few seconds. A question rose, and she asked it as soon as she thought it. What brought this on, anyway? It seems sudden. Is it really just Prince Verdant? When Celestia didn't answer right away, Twilight looked back up to see her mentor staring at the ceiling, her teacup still suspended by her side in a golden aura. Not just Verdant, no, the princess replied eventually. This will be good for Luna, as well. She needs some time in the spotlight in order to shine. And, well, this feels a little silly to admit, but I've been thinking about my legacy, recently. Twilight tilted her head, confused. Legacy? I'm not sure I know what you mean. Perhaps I'm getting old, Celestia said softly. Or, perhaps it's just because I've made myself responsible for the raising of a cult. I've started thinking about the things I may leave behind. The fear and confusion from earlier raised its head. Twilight shivered and asked, leave behind? I thought it was only for 5 years. Give or take. Celestia didn't answer her right away, instead gazing down towards the table. A few seconds passed, enough for Twilight to start feeling fidgety. Right before she broke the silence to repeat her question, Celestia spoke again. Have you ever heard of Queen Sapphire the Vile? Twilight blinked, her thoughts completely derailed by the question. She racked her memory, trying to come up with a match for the name. After some deep thought, she shook her head. No, princess, I can't say I have. Not surprising, Celestia said with a short laugh. A thoroughly unpleasant pony, as you can likely gather from the epithet. Why would she pick that? Spike asked. Seems like a good way to give a pony a bad opinion of her. She didn't pick it, Spike, Celestia replied. Her subjects did, not long after her death. It's those that survive you who will decide how you're remembered. Celestia shook her head gently. No, during her reign she was called Queen Sapphire the Magnificent, or the Righteous, or even the Beautiful. Celestia frowned and added, and probably a few others I'm forgetting. But after she died, it was the Vile that was remembered until history apparently forgot her name entirely. Why was she called that? Twilight asked as her horn glowed. A scroll floated out, along with her inkwell and quill. Celestia nodded approvingly as Twilight prepared to write down the story as accurately as she could manage. Long ago, the princess began, the 3 pony races joined themselves into one Equestria. This was not universally popular. Queen Sapphire was a descendant of the old unicorn kings and queens, a great-granddaughter to King Diamond. Her grandmother, Princess Platinum, had betrayed her lineage, or at least that's what young Sapphire and her supporters believed. She left the newly born Equestria with a number of unicorns who felt the same way. They gathered up as many Pegasus and Earth pony loyalists as they could. Though, there were some rumors that not all of those Pegasi and Earth ponies went willingly. That's horrible. Celestia nodded. Yes, Twilight, but I'm afraid the young queen was just getting started. She and her followers founded a kingdom of their own and named it Karinika. Unicorns ruled absolutely, as they believed they should. Pegasi and Earth ponies were treated harshly. At best, as servants. At worst, well, the rumors were bad. She developed a technique, you see, a way to punish those who were disloyal or disobedient, which the Queen considered the most heinous of crimes. It was a process that they called the separation. They would take the offending pony, and they would forcefully remove them from the magical field. Twilight gasped. Celestia nodded, her expression somber. Indeed. She stripped those poor ponies of their magic. Their cutie marks would fade, and they would become dull and listless. Many didn't survive their first month. Those that did were treated little better than animals, used for hard labor. They called these poor ponies, the Fateless. The unicorn elites weren't spared, for all their power and position. The Queen grew increasingly paranoid as she grew older, and began to see plots and conspiracies everywhere. Due to her harsh methods, those conspiracies soon became a reality. She was assassinated in her own bedchamber by a coalition of unicorn nobles, each of whom had lost someone dear to them to the separation. They'd been pushed too far, you see. And that is how Queen Sapphire the Magnificent became known as Queen Sapphire the Vile. A name well earned, perhaps. Celestia smiled, and the room seemed to brighten as the shadows cast by her story fled. When your friend Erin stopped by a few days ago, she reminded me of the story once again. She did. Twilight asked, feeling a little stunned by the statement. The first hint I had of Erin's existence was when Professor Glimmer came to me a while ago and mentioned that you were writing a story about a mare who wasn't part of the magical field. Celestia said, either not noticing or ignoring Twilight's flinch when reminded of the lie she told. I was afraid that some pony had somehow discovered the means to create more Fateless. Imagine my relief when I discovered that it was only a disguised pony from another world looking for a new home for several billion people. Celestia laughed, and Twilight joined in weakly. Perhaps that's why I've been thinking about it, Celestia said before taking another sip of her tea. I've been thinking about what I'll leave behind, should I ever stop being Princess Celestia. Verdant will be a part of that, I think, as will a stable, thriving nation, I hope. But still, I wonder, what will the ponies think of me, should I ever step down? What byname will they attach to me? The Radiant, Twilight said instantly, blushing when she realized she'd said it out loud. Celestia stared at her for a moment before breaking into soft laughter. Thank you, Twilight, but I wasn't fishing for compliments. She sighed and set her cup down on the table. Just the musings of an old mare, perhaps. In any case, enough of old, dead queens and such unpleasantness. Tell me, Twilight, how has life been in Ponyville recently? Twilight smiled, feeling some tension ebb. She'd discovered what Princess Celestia's big secret project was, and it was something she was planning to do anyway. And all the talk of her stepping back from the throne, well, that would take some getting used to, but it wasn't the end of the world. She put her scroll aside, though after she made a note to ask about whatever happened to the kingdom of Karinika. Well, first, she said, let me tell you about the name Pinkie Pie came up with for her tablet. Erin *. So, what do you think? Erin didn't answer right away, concentrating on chewing and swallowing first. The casserole was sweet and tangy and savory all at once, with a mix of crunchy and smooth textures. It wasn't something you'd find in a fancy restaurant or anything. It had that undefinable something that identified it as something a mom cooked. She looked up to see Ditsy's smile, though the Pegasus had an undercurrent of worry around the eyes. Erin smiled back. It's delicious, she said, and Ditsy relaxed visibly. Course it is, Dinky piped up. Mama's the best cook in Ponyville. No, my mom is, Marigold replied in her matter-of-fact voice. No. She is, though. Tell her, Sunflower. Erin froze in a panic as two sets of intense filly eyes locked onto her. Fortunately, her mouth was full of more casserole, so she didn't have to answer right away. Ditsy laughed and came to her rescue. Now, it's not fair to put her on the spot like that. She reached over and ruffled Marigold's mane. Dinky thinks my cooking is the best because she grew up with it, just like you grew up with your mom's, right? Marigold's eyes narrowed. My mom is the best cook, though. Opinions can't be right or wrong, Marigold, Erin said. You think your mom's cooking is the best, Dinky thinks her mom's is the best, and you're both right. Well, whose do you think is the best? Marigold asked, her eyes a little heated. The best cook ever. Erin asked. Marigold nodded. That's easy, my mom. The answer didn't seem to please Marigold, but both Dinky and Ditsy started laughing. Marigold looked a little put off for a while before the corner of her mouth tilted up slightly. She shoveled more carrot casserole into her mouth to hide the smile. The dinner carried on without much conflict after that. The two fillies dominated the conversation, mostly by asking Erin question after question about what it was like to be a human. When she told them about skyscrapers and jet airplanes, their faces went from intrigued to skeptical. Are you just messing with us? Dinky asked. Nope. Erin grinned and speared a cherry tomato out of her salad with a fork that she'd secured to her hoof with a thick rubber band. We have all sorts of really cool stuff. Haven't you seen the big TV screen in the library? Yeah. That's really cool, Dinky said. Marigold nodded somberly and added, sometimes Miss Buttercup will take a class there and we'll watch a movie. Miss Buttercup. Is that your kindergarten teacher? Erin asked. Yeah, Marigold said with a nod. Her face scrunched up. The movies are usually about animals. I don't care about animals. Not if you have metal tubes with wings that can fly. Yeah. I want to see stuff like that, Dinky said, standing on her chair with her forehooves on the table. Dinky, manners. Ditsy scolded lightly. The filly blushed and sat back down, the perfect picture of politeness. For all of about 2 seconds, and then she was grinning and bouncing in her seat. So, y'all think we can get documentaries on cool stuff, or see some regular movies, sometime? There are tons of movies with the entertainment center I gave to Twilight, Erin said. You haven't seen any of them? No. Marigold huffed, crossing her legs across her chest. Miss Buttercup says only educational stuff. She snorted. And the screen thing in the library looks so much cooler than the one in the movie theater. Dinky said, still bouncing. An idea took root in Erin's mind. I'll have to see what I can do about that. The fillies seemed satisfied with that, and the rest of dinner passed in idle chit-chat, mostly filly-driven talk of school and art and playground shenanigans. When the dinner plates were cleared away, Ditsy came out with the box containing the last of Erin's sugar cube corner treats. If the fillies noticed that the treats were a little stale, they certainly didn't complain about it. Ditzy had just refused Erin's second offer to help wash the dishes when a sharp knocking sounded at the front door. Ditzy excused herself to answer it, which allowed Erin to sneak into the kitchen and start stealth washing some dirty plates in her sink. Marigold sat in the kitchen doorway, watching her with curious eyes. "Why don't you use magic?" she asked. "You've got a horn." "I haven't learned how to use it yet," Erin admitted. She was standing on only her rear hooves, using her front hooves to try and clean the dishes in the hot, soapy water. It was clumsy and awkward work for her. "I'm still learning, too. You can probably use more magic than I can, kiddo." Erin looked back over to shoot the familiar grin, which froze on her face at the sight of the expressionless mare that stood behind her. "Marigold, get your things," Meadowlark said coldly. "We're going home." Marigold had jumped halfway out of her skin at the unexpected sound of her mother's voice. Now she was sitting there with a trembling pout as she looked up at her mother. "But, no. Get your things. We're leaving." She shot an icy glare at Erin. "I thought I told you to stay away from her." Erin's mouth worked soundlessly for a few seconds. Meadowlark wordlessly scooped Marigold up with her magic, ignoring the squawk of protest from her daughter, and deposited her on her back. "Why should she stay away from me, Mom?" Marigold asked. Meadowlark didn't answer her, instead turning and walking away. As Meadowlark got further away, Marigold's whining got more and more distant, until it was finally cut off by a slamming door. Erin's head spun, and the strength seemed to leave her all at once. She slumped against the kitchen sink, staring at the floor as tears burned at her eyes. She tried to plan. She tried to think of something she could say or do that would make things all right again, but all she could think of was that she'd blown it. She didn't know if Meadowlark would ever forgive her, which not only meant that she might not ever be friends with her again, not to mention that she wouldn't be allowed to see Marigold. When Ditzy cleared her throat, Erin shook herself and realized that she'd been staring at nothing for the last minute or two. She blinked her eyes and rubbed her leg across her eyes before looking up to see a shamefaced Ditzy standing in front of her. "Well, that could have gone better," Ditzy said sheepishly. Erin let out a pained chuckle. Yeah, it really could have." She glanced up to see Dinky peeking around the doorframe. The filly's head jerked back the moment she realized she'd been spotted, which turned Erin's laugh a little more genuine. "Look, I'm sorry," Ditzy said. "I didn't realize that she was that mad." "Not your fault," Erin said, shaking her head. She pushed away from the kitchen counter and dropped back to all four hooves. "I'm the one who was supposed to stay away from Marigold." Ditzy snorted, sounding a little angry. "That filly adores you. Meadowlark isn't doing her any favors." Erin grunted noncommittally. "Gotta be disappointing, though," Ditzy said thoughtfully. "What? All that work being nice, and you didn't even get to slurp up one single filly brain." Erin gaped at Ditzy, who was wearing a big, cheesy grin. A tiny voice came from around the corner, tinged with horrified, eager fascination. "You eat filly brains?" Dinky asked. Erin started laughing along with Ditzy as most of the tension fled the room. In the aftermath, Ditzy relented and allowed Erin to help with washing the dishes, which turned into a three-pony affair. Erin scrubbed off the food, Ditzy rinsed, and Dinky's little face scrunched up in concentration as she used the cloth in her hooves to dry them. When Erin finally went home an hour later, it wasn't as bad of a mood as she had been in immediately after Meadowlark's departure. Still, as she lay on her couch and stared off into the shadows, she wasn't able to get Meadowlark's coldly furious face out of her mind. It seemed pretty likely that she might have made any kind of reconciliation impossible.